The air above the Nile River was still cool when the first workers began to wake. Darkness still rested softly over the mud brick homes along the narrow streets. Small cooking fires had not yet been lit. Most doors remained closed. A faint gray light waited far away beyond the eastern horizon, where the desert stretched into silence. Inside one small house, a young boy opened his eyes before dawn. He heard breathing around him in the darkness. His younger sisters still slept beside their mother beneath woven linen blankets spread across the floor. Near the doorway, his father was already awake, sitting quietly on a low stool while tying worn leather sandals around tired feet. The boy did not speak yet. In many homes along the Nile, mornings began without many words. People saved their strength for the long heat of the day ahead. Outside, somewhere farther down the street, a donkey gave a slow cry into the quiet air. A dog barked once and then settled again. Water moved softly against the riverbank nearby, steady and calm in the darkness. The boy rubbed sleep from his eyes and sat up slowly. He was not considered very young anymore. In the ancient world, childhood was often treated less like a protected season of life and more like a slow preparation for work, duty, and survival. A child was expected to move steadily toward usefulness. Small hands would someday carry baskets, shape clay, pull fishing nets, grind grain, sweep temple floors, or copy careful lines of ink onto papyrus. And so, long before the sun rose above the fields, many children began learning the rhythm of labor. The boy stood quietly while his mother handed him a rough piece of bread left from the night before. It was dry now, but still filling. He ate slowly while listening to the familiar sounds of waking life around him. A clay jar scraped lightly against the floor. Sandals brushed against stone. Someone outside coughed into the cold morning air. The river continued its endless movement through the darkness. The boy's father finally spoke in a low voice. Today they would help repair irrigation channels near the flooded fields north of the village. The river had recently begun to retreat after the season of flooding, leaving behind rich black soil that farmers depended upon each year. Water channels had to be cleared carefully before planting could begin again. The boy nodded. He had gone before. His arms were still thin, and his hands still soft compared to older workers, but he was already expected to learn how to carry mud, stack reeds, and follow instructions without complaint. No one called this unfair. To the people living along the Nile thousands of years ago, life itself required constant work. Families survived together or struggled together. Every pair of hands mattered. Even very small children often carried responsibilities. Some gathered water. Some watched younger siblings. Some swept homes or shaped dough beside their mothers. Others followed fathers into fields, workshops, boats, or crowded market roads. Life moved slowly, but it rarely paused. The first pale light of dawn slowly touched the tops of distant palms. The village began to wake more fully now. Thin trails of smoke rose from cooking fires between the flat rooftops. Women stepped quietly into narrow lanes carrying jars toward the river. A fisherman moved past with nets over one shoulder, still damp from the previous night's work. The smell of baking bread slowly entered the cool air. The boy stepped outside beside his father. The earth beneath his sandals felt cold for now, though both knew the heat would arrive soon enough. By midday, the roads would shimmer beneath the sun. Dust would cling to sweaty skin. Workers would move more slowly beneath the heavy brightness pressing down from above. But early morning still belonged to softness. The village rested between night and labor. The boy looked toward the Nile. Even in dim light, the river seemed alive with quiet motion. Reeds shifted gently near the shore. Small boats rocked against wooden posts. Somewhere farther away, hidden by mist, another village was beginning its morning too. Many children there were also waking early. Some were sons of fishermen. Some belonged to farming families. Some lived within crowded city streets near temple walls and workshops. Others served inside larger homes where wealthy families slept beneath finer linen and cooler rooms. But almost all children understood something very early. One day, they would work. One day, they would carry burdens. One day, they would become part of the endless movement of daily survival that shaped the ancient world. The boy and his father began walking north beside the river path. The ground still held moisture from the yearly flood. Their sandals pressed softly into dark soil while insects hummed low in the reeds nearby. Ahead, other workers joined the path one by one, most carrying wooden tools across tired shoulders. Few people hurried. The day was long. There was no need to waste energy before sunrise. As they walked, the boy listened carefully to the sounds around him. This too was part of learning. Ancient children were expected to observe constantly. Knowledge often passed quietly through watching rather than formal teaching. He noticed how older workers checked the color of the soil, how they studied water levels, how they spoke about weather, planting, and river patterns in calm, practical voices. These lessons mattered more than stories. A child who learned slowly could bring hardship to the family later. The Nile gave life generously, but survival still depended upon skill, patience, and endurance. By the time sunlight touched the fields, dozens of workers had gathered near the irrigation channels. The flooded earth smelled rich and heavy beneath the warming air. Men stepped carefully into the mud, digging blocked passages with wooden tools while boys carried reeds away from the water's edge. Nearby, a few younger children sat together shaping wet clay into rough baskets for carrying soil. Nobody separated children completely from adult life. There was little distance between the world of the young and the world of the grown. Children watched births, illness, labor, exhaustion, arguments, prayers, and death from very early ages. Life unfolded openly around them. And slowly, they entered its rhythm. The boy worked beside his father through the morning hours. Mud coated his ankles. Sweat gathered along his neck. Sometimes he paused to straighten his back and stare toward the distant desert hills glowing softly beneath the growing sun. The landscape itself seemed endless. Green fields stretched along the riverbanks, while beyond them the dry golden world of sand and stone waited silently beneath the heat. Birds circled overhead. Water insects drifted above the reeds. Somewhere nearby, another group of workers sang softly while lifting heavy baskets together in slow rhythm. The song was not cheerful exactly. It simply helped the body continue moving. Ancient labor often depended upon rhythm. Grinding grain, pulling ropes, rowing boats, kneading bread, cutting stone. Children learned these rhythms early, until movement itself became almost automatic. As the morning passed, the sun climbed higher. The cool softness of dawn disappeared. Heat settled across the fields like a heavy blanket. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads while sweat darkened their simple clothing. The smell of wet soil mixed with river water and warm reeds beneath the growing brightness. The boy's father finally rested beside the channel edge. Without speaking much, he handed the boy a small jar of water. The boy drank carefully. Even rest felt quiet here. Around them, workers sat beneath thin patches of shade whenever they could find them. Some ate onions or dried fish with rough bread. Others simply closed tired eyes for a few moments before returning to work again. A nearby child no older than 7 carried a basket almost too large for his arms. No one seemed surprised. In the ancient world, many children began contributing physically long before their bodies were fully ready. Childhood was not usually imagined as a long protected stage separated from responsibility. Instead, it was preparation. Preparation for labor. Preparation for marriage. Preparation for survival. Preparation for continuing the family itself. This did not mean parents lacked love for their children. Far from it. Ancient families often cared deeply for one another. Mothers worried over sickness. Fathers taught skills carefully. Families grieved terribly when children died, which happened far too often in a world without modern medicine. But affection existed beside necessity. A child was precious partly because life was fragile, and because survival required everyone together. The boy watched dragonflies drift above the water while his father rested nearby. He wondered how long it would take before he could work a full day without exhaustion. Older boys already could. Some carried heavy stone. Some managed boats alone. Some traveled with merchant caravans along dusty roads far from home. By 13 or 14, many were treated almost fully as adults. The slow space we now imagine between childhood and adulthood barely existed for most ordinary ancient people. The sun continued rising. The air became thick with heat. In the distance, palm trees shimmered softly above the riverbanks. The boy returned to work again. Hours later, when afternoon finally began softening toward evening, the workers started their long walk back toward the village. Everyone moved more slowly now. Bodies ached. Feet dragged through dust. Children who had worked since dawn leaned against parents or older siblings while walking home beneath the fading light. The boy felt soreness in his shoulders. Mud had dried against his legs. But he also felt something else quietly growing inside him. Pride. Not loud pride. Not spoken pride. Just the quiet feeling that he had endured the day beside the others. That mattered deeply in the ancient world. Endurance itself was respected. The village looked softer now beneath evening light. Smoke rose lazily into the orange sky. Women prepared the night meal beside open ovens while neighbors exchanged tired greetings in narrow lanes. Somewhere nearby, someone played a simple reed flute with slow drifting notes that floated gently through the warm air. The Nile reflected fading sunlight like moving bronze. The boy's mother greeted them at the doorway. Inside the home, the younger children already sat waiting beside small bowls of lentils and bread. The room smelled warm from cooking grain and onions over the fire. The family ate together quietly. Night arrived slowly beyond the doorway. Insects hummed outside. The heat remained trapped inside the mud brick walls, though cooler air would eventually come later after midnight. The boy listened while the adults spoke softly about water levels, crop conditions, and work assignments for the coming days. Even during meals, life remained tied closely to labor. The Nile controlled nearly everything. Floods, planting, harvests, taxes, food supplies. A child growing up along the river learned this naturally before learning almost anything else. After eating, the younger children grew sleepy quickly. One small girl rested her head against her mother's lap while the adults continued speaking softly in the dim firelight. The boy sat near the doorway. Outside, stars slowly appeared above the dark river. Somewhere farther down the village road, footsteps faded into silence. A donkey shifted beside a wall. Then stillness returned again. Night in the ancient world could feel deeply quiet once labor ended. Without bright city lights or endless noise, darkness settled fully over the land. Only firelight flickered softly through doorways while the Nile continued moving unseen beside sleeping villages. The boy's eyes grew heavy. Tomorrow would begin before sunrise again. There would be more work. More learning. More slow movement toward adulthood. And this pattern continued not only in Egypt, but across much of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, children woke early beside the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, helping shape bricks from river mud beneath the growing heat. In Greece, boys followed fathers into olive groves, fishing boats, or crowded workshops smelling of metal and smoke. In ancient China, children learned farming rhythms beside flooded rice fields while elders watched carefully for discipline and obedience. In Rome, children of poor families often worked in streets, markets, kitchens, or farms before reaching full maturity. Everywhere, childhood was closely tied to preparation. Not preparation for dreams far away. Preparation for survival close at hand. Back inside the mud brick home beside the Nile, the family slowly prepared for sleep. Blankets were spread across the floor. The cooking fire dimmed lower. The mother checked carefully on the youngest children while the father stretched sore muscles after the long day's labor. The boy lay down quietly beside his siblings. Outside, warm wind moved softly through the narrow streets. The river whispered faintly in the darkness beyond the village walls. And beneath the endless stars of the ancient Egyptian sky, another child drifted slowly toward sleep, already stepping little by little into the long working life waiting ahead. Before dawn returned to the Nile Valley, the village rested beneath a blanket of deep blue darkness. The air had cooled at last. Inside the mud brick homes, families slept closely together on woven mats and linen cloth spread across hard floors. Some homes held only one room. Others had small storage spaces for grain jars, baskets, tools, and folded blankets. In wealthier houses farther south near larger towns, inner courtyards sometimes allowed a little night air to drip through open spaces. But for ordinary workers, comfort was usually simple and limited. Even in sleep, life remained close. Children heard parents breathing beside them. Infants stirred softly during the night. Someone always coughed somewhere nearby. The smells of baked bread, smoke, river mud, sweat, and warm clay lingered gently in the darkness. The young boy beside the Nile slept deeply after the long day in the irrigation fields. His hands still carried faint traces of dried mud beneath his fingernails. His shoulders ached in a dull quiet way that no longer surprised him. Outside, the river moved endlessly through the dark. The Nile never truly rested. Long before sunrise, fishermen already pushed narrow boats into the black water. Their oars dipped slowly and carefully beneath the stars while small lantern flames trembled against the darkness. Nets lay coiled beside their feet, damp from years of use. Among them sat boys not much older than 10 or 11. Some had gone onto the water since they were very small. They learned where fish gathered near reeds. They learned how currents shifted during flood seasons. They learned how to untangle wet rope in silence without wasting time. A careless child could damage valuable nets or upset a small boat far from shore. And so learning began early. One fisherman sat near the center of his narrow vessel while his son watched closely beside him. The father spoke softly, explaining how to feel the pull of the net through the rope itself. Not every lesson required words. The boy studied the movement of his father's hands beneath the lantern glow. The quiet concentration. The patience. The slow rhythm. These were things children absorbed naturally from daily life. Far away from palaces and temples, much of ancient childhood unfolded through imitation. A child learned by standing near adults for years, watching the endless repetition of labor until the motions became familiar inside the body itself. The boat drifted slowly through dark water. Mist floated low above the river's surface. Reeds brushed softly against the hull. The father cast the net outward in one smooth movement, and the boy watched carefully again. One day the motion would belong to him too. Back in the village, the first roosters began calling into the darkness. The young boy inside the mud brick house slowly opened his eyes. For a few moments he remained still, listening. Nearby, his mother had already begun grinding grain using a heavy stone grinder. The sound was slow and steady, like rough sand rubbing against itself. It was one of the most common sounds in the ancient world. Women and girls spent countless hours grinding grain into flour for bread. The labor was repetitive and exhausting. Arms and backs often became sore from the constant movement. Dust from the grain floated into the air and settled into lungs over many years. But bread fed the household. And so the work continued day after day. The boy sat up quietly. Firelight flickered against the walls while shadows shifted gently across clay jars stacked near the corner of the room. His youngest sister still slept with one arm beneath her cheek. His mother looked tired already. She had likely slept only lightly during the night while caring for the smaller children and preparing for another full day before sunrise even arrived. Ancient mothers carried enormous burdens quietly. They cooked, fetched water, mended clothing, prepared grain, raised children, managed household tasks. Sometimes they also worked in fields, markets, or workshops beside the men. Girls watched these routines from very young ages. A daughter's preparation for adulthood often began almost as soon as she could walk steadily. The boy's older sister was already awake too. She knelt beside their mother shaping dough into flat round loaves before baking. Her hands moved carefully, pressing and turning the dough with practiced motions she had repeated many times already. She was perhaps 12 years old. In many ancient societies, 12 was no longer considered very young. Families had already begun thinking about future marriages, household duties, and adult responsibilities by that age. The modern idea of long teenage years filled with freedom and personal discovery simply did not exist for most ordinary ancient people. Life moved more directly toward necessity. The smell of fresh dough slowly filled the room. Outside, faint gray light touched the horizon again. The village stirred awake. The boy stepped outside carrying an empty water jar. The morning air felt cool against his skin, though only for a little while. Soon the heat would rise once more across the river valley. Other children walked the narrow paths too. Some carried baskets. Some led goats through the streets. Some balanced water jars carefully against their hips while walking toward the riverbank. Nobody seemed rushed. The pace of life followed the sun itself. Slow before dawn. Heavy by noon. Quiet again after sunset. At the river's edge, women and children gathered near the water. Some washed clothing against smooth stones. Others filled jars while speaking softly together beneath the pale morning sky. Nearby, a small group of boys chased each other briefly along the muddy bank before an older man called them sharply back toward work. Even play itself often existed in small moments between duties. Children laughed sometimes, certainly. They invented games. They splashed in shallow water. They climbed rocks and chased stray dogs through village lanes. But these moments were woven carefully around labor rather than separated from it. The boy filled the clay jar slowly. The Nile water felt cool against his fingers. He paused for a moment to watch sunlight finally spreading across the river. Golden reflections trembled softly on the moving surface while birds drifted low above the reeds. The beauty of the river belonged to daily life. People noticed it quietly while working, while carrying water, while rowing boats, while washing clothes. The natural world stayed close to ordinary existence in a way difficult to imagine now. The river was not visited occasionally. It shaped every hour of life. The boy carried the heavy jar carefully back toward home. Already he could hear workshops opening farther down the village road. Wood striking wood. Animals shifting awake. Potters beginning their morning labor. The scent of smoke drifted upward into the warming air. Today his father would travel into a nearby town to assist with repairs near a storage building beside the temple grounds. The boy would go with him. Temple complexes in ancient Egypt were enormous places of constant movement and labor. While priests performed rituals within sacred rooms, thousands of ordinary workers also filled the surrounding spaces. Builders repaired walls. Gardeners carried water. Servants swept courtyards. Bakers prepared bread offerings. Scribes copied records carefully onto papyrus. Warehouse workers counted grain deliveries beneath the heat. Children moved through these spaces too, learning future roles slowly over time. After a small morning meal, the boy and his father began walking south along the dusty road toward town. The sun climbed steadily higher behind them. Fields stretched green beside the river while farmers already bent low over wet soil. Oxen pulled wooden plows slowly through the earth. Birds followed close behind, searching for insects stirred from the ground. The smell of damp soil mixed with warm air and growing heat. The father walked quietly most of the way. Conversation often remained practical among working families. There was little spare energy for endless talking after years of physical labor beneath the sun. Still, children learned constantly through simple remarks. The father pointed toward cracks forming along an older irrigation wall near the road. He explained how poor repairs could destroy entire sections during future floods. The boy listened carefully. Attention mattered. A careless worker could bring serious hardship to others. As they neared town, the road became busier. Merchants guided donkeys loaded with baskets of onions, fish, grain, and pottery. Laborers carried bundles across tired shoulders while temple servants moved through the streets in clean white linen clothing. Dust rose beneath countless sandals. The heat deepened steadily. The town itself smelled of bread ovens, crowded bodies, smoke, animals, and river water drying beneath the sun. The boy stayed close beside his father while moving through narrow streets lined with mud brick buildings. Open workshops revealed craftsmen already working hard despite the early hour. Inside one workshop, a bronze worker hammered glowing metal carefully while sweat rolled down his neck. Inside another, boys sat cross-legged twisting reeds into baskets beneath the watchful eyes of older craftsmen. A carpenter shaved wood slowly with simple tools while his young apprentice gathered scattered pieces from the floor. Apprenticeship shaped much of ancient childhood. A child born into a craftsman's household often entered the same trade naturally. Learning required years of observation and repetition. Mistakes could waste expensive materials. And so young workers began with simple tasks first. Sweeping floors. Carrying tools. Mixing clay. Preparing fires. Watching carefully. Only slowly did responsibility grow larger. The father and son finally reached the temple storage buildings. Tall walls cast long strips of shade across the stone ground. Workers moved in and out carrying baskets filled with grain while scribes sat nearby recording deliveries with careful brush strokes. The boy watched the scribes with fascination. Their fingers moved lightly across papyrus while black ink formed graceful symbols in neat rows. Scribes held unusual importance in Egyptian society because writing itself required specialized learning. Literacy was rare among ordinary workers. Most children never attended formal schools. But some boys, especially sons of scribes or officials, spent years memorizing symbols, copying texts, and practicing discipline inside small learning houses attached to temples or government buildings. These children still worked hard. Their labor simply looked different. Hours of copying symbols by hand demanded patience beyond their years. Mistakes brought punishment. Teachers expected obedience and endurance. Even education itself was preparation for duty. The boy stared quietly at the scribes while his father began repair work nearby. For a moment he imagined what it might feel like to hold a reed pen instead of a mud shovel. But such paths depended greatly upon birth, family position, and opportunity. Most children followed the work already surrounding them from infancy onward. And so the boy soon lifted heavy baskets beside the other workers once again. The hours passed slowly beneath the burning sun. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Stone walls radiated trapped heat. The workers paused only briefly to drink water and eat rough bread beneath narrow strips of shade. Children rested there too, breathing hard after carrying loads too heavy for growing bodies. Yet nobody expected comfort. Endurance remained part of life itself. By afternoon, the entire town seemed to move more slowly beneath the weight of heat. Dogs slept beside walls. Merchants spoke less loudly. Even flies drifted lazily through the thick air. The boy's father finally finished repairing the damaged wall section near sunset. Together they began the long walk home beside the river once more. Now the world softened again. Golden light stretched across the fields. Workers returned slowly toward villages carrying tools over weary shoulders. The Nile reflected pale orange sky while distant boats drifted silently southward with the current. The boy felt deeply tired. But evening carried its own quiet beauty after labor ended. Children along the road became softer now. Less serious. One little girl walked beside her mother humming quietly to herself while balancing reeds against one shoulder. Two brothers tossed pebbles toward the roadside while their father pretended not to notice. Exhaustion often brought calm rather than noise. When they finally reached home, the smell of lentil stew drifted warmly through the doorway. Inside, the younger children sat waiting in the dim evening light while the mother stirred food slowly above the fire. Night gathered gently around the village again. And beyond the mud brick walls, beyond the fields and riverbanks, countless other children across the ancient world prepared quietly for lives that would ask much from them long before adulthood fully arrived. The night settled softly over the Nile Valley once more. A warm wind drifted through the narrow village lanes, carrying the smell of river water, cooling stone, and distant cooking fires that had not fully gone out. Above the flat rooftops, stars spread endlessly across the dark sky, clear and bright without smoke or city light to hide them. Inside the small mud brick house, the family slept close together. The youngest children had curled toward their mother during the night. One small hand rested gently against her arm while she slept lightly beside the fading warmth of the cooking fire. Near the doorway, the father lay on his back with one arm over his eyes, exhausted from another day beneath the sun. The older boy slept deeply at first. Then slowly, before dawn, he woke again to silence. For a few moments he remained still beneath the darkness. He listened to the breathing around him. The soft crackle of cooling ash. A dog barking far away near the riverbank. The quiet movement of wind through palm leaves outside. These sounds were deeply familiar to children growing up in the ancient world. Night carried its own language. Without lamps burning through the dark hours, people became sensitive to small noises around them. A creaking roof beam. Footsteps outside. The rustle of reeds beside the water. The distant splash of an oar in the Nile before sunrise. The boy slowly sat up. His body already knew the rhythm of waking early. In ancient Egypt, many children rose before dawn almost every day of their lives. Sleeping late belonged mostly to sickness, special festivals, or the wealthy few who could afford greater comfort. Ordinary life followed labor. And labor followed the sun. The mother stirred awake soon after. Without speaking much, she reached for the grain basket beside the wall. The daily work of preparing bread would begin again now, just as it had the morning before and countless mornings before that. The boy watched her quietly. Even half asleep, her hands moved with practiced certainty. Pour grain. Lift the grinding stone. Press forward. Pull back. Again and again. The sound filled the room slowly. Stone against grain. Grain against stone. A rough steady rhythm before dawn. Beside her, the older sister woke too. Her hair remained loose from sleep as she rubbed tired eyes and moved closer to help prepare the morning fire. Tiny sparks drifted upward while dry reeds caught flame beneath the clay oven. The smell of smoke spread gently through the house. Outside, darkness still covered the village. But life had already begun. A neighbor walked past carrying water jars balanced carefully across his shoulders. Somewhere farther away, an animal shifted inside a small enclosure beside another home. Faint voices moved softly through the darkness before fading again. The ancient world often woke quietly. No engines. No bright lights. No sudden noise. Only human movement beginning slowly beneath the stars. The boy stepped outside carrying a small basket. Today he would help gather reeds near the river before joining his father later at the fields. Reeds were used for many things in Egyptian life. Mats, baskets, sandals, roofing materials, fishing tools, writing brushes, and simple household items all depended upon river plants gathered by ordinary workers. Nothing along the Nile was wasted easily. The river provided life in countless forms. The air felt cool against his skin as he walked toward the water. Mist floated low above the Nile, soft and pale beneath the fading night sky. Palm trees stood motionless along the shore while clusters of reeds swayed gently beside the moving current. Other children were already there. Two girls worked beside their grandmother cutting long reeds with careful hands. Nearby, a younger boy struggled to carry a bundle almost larger than himself while his older brother laughed quietly before helping him. Children often worked beside many generations at once. Grandparents, parents, older siblings, uncles and cousins. Knowledge moved naturally through families this way. The boy stepped into the shallow water near the riverbank. Mud pressed cool between his toes. He bent carefully and began cutting reeds one by one while birds slowly woke overhead. The sky lightened from black to deep blue now, and the first faint gold of sunrise touched the eastern horizon. The Nile looked endless in this early light. Wide. Silent. Ancient. For thousands of years, children had stood beside these same waters learning the same lessons of work and endurance. The river connected generations quietly together. A small fishing boat drifted nearby. An old fisherman sat at the stern while two boys worked beside him untangling rope from the night's catch. Their movements looked slow from a distance, almost peaceful beneath the pale dawn sky. But the work was tiring. Everything in ancient life demanded physical effort. Fetching water. Grinding grain. Fishing. Carrying stone. Building walls. Plowing fields. Even maintaining a simple household required endless labor from sunrise until darkness returned. Children entered this world gradually, but very early. The boy tied the gathered reeds together with rough cord. His fingers worked carefully. Small mistakes mattered less now than they once had. He had practiced these tasks many times already. Slowly, almost without noticing, childhood moved closer toward competence. This was the purpose many ancient societies saw in youth. Not self-expression. Not discovery. Preparation. A child learned to become useful. Useful to the household. Useful to the fields. Useful to the workshop. Useful to the future survival of the family itself. By sunrise, the village roads had filled with movement again. The boy returned home carrying reeds over one shoulder while the warmth of morning spread across the land. Thin smoke curled upward from ovens. Donkeys moved slowly through narrow streets. Somewhere nearby, a woman sang softly while sweeping dust from her doorway. Inside the house, breakfast waited. Simple bread. A few dates. Weak beer mixed lightly with water. The family ate together quietly. The younger children looked sleepy still, their heads nodding slightly while chewing warm bread fresh from the oven. The father finally spoke. Today there would be additional work farther from the village near newly planted fields. The flooding season had left rich soil behind, but the planting itself required enormous labor from entire communities. The boy nodded and finished eating. Soon they were walking once more beneath the growing sunlight. Dust rose softly beneath their sandals. The father carried wooden farming tools across his shoulders while the boy followed close beside him. Along the road, other families traveled toward the fields too. Some carried baskets of seed grain. Others guided animals slowly through the warming air. A pregnant woman walked carefully beside her husband while balancing supplies against one hip. Life did not pause easily for exhaustion. People continued because they had to. The fields near the river shimmered green and black beneath the morning light. Water channels stretched carefully between sections of fertile earth while farmers bent low preparing rows for planting. The smell of wet soil rose heavily into the air. Birds circled overhead searching freshly turned ground. Already sweat gathered along workers' necks beneath the strengthening heat. The boy joined other children carrying seed baskets from one end of the field to another. The loads were not terribly heavy at first, but repetition slowly wore down growing muscles. Back and forth. Again and again. Children learned endurance through repetition more than instruction. An older farmer nearby called out corrections whenever someone spilled seed carelessly or walked unevenly across the prepared rows. Attention mattered. Food depended upon precision. As the morning passed, the heat deepened steadily. The bright Egyptian sun pressed downward across the fields until even breathing felt slower. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while wiping sweat from tired faces. The boy's feet became coated in dark wet soil. Mud dried against his ankles beneath the heat. Still he continued moving. Nearby, another child no older than 8 stumbled while carrying a basket too quickly. Seed spilled across the ground. The older farmer sighed but did not grow angry. He simply motioned for the child to gather it carefully and begin again. Mistakes were expected from children. But improvement was expected too. Ancient childhood carried patience in some ways and harshness in others. Adults understood that children needed years to learn proper work. Yet there was often little room for long periods of idleness. Families depended upon contribution. The boy paused briefly beside an irrigation channel to drink water from a clay jar. The water tasted cool and slightly earthy. For a moment he looked across the fields toward the distant village barely visible beyond palms and reeds. Smoke drifted upward into the bright sky. Somewhere back there, his mother and sister continued their own endless work inside the home. Women's labor rarely ended. Even while the men worked the fields, women prepared food, cared for children, carried water, mended clothing, cleaned floors, managed storage jars, and often worked outside the home as well. Girls watched this carefully from very young ages. The older sister already understood many household responsibilities completely. Within only a few more years, she might marry into another household nearby and begin managing similar duties herself. Marriage often came early in the ancient world. Life expectancy was uncertain. Families formed young. Childhood moved quickly toward adulthood because survival itself felt uncertain and fragile. As noon approached, workers rested briefly beneath woven shade coverings near the edge of the fields. The atmosphere changed during these moments. Voices grew softer. Bodies slowed. People sat heavily on the ground while eating bread, onions, and dried fish from small baskets carried from home. The boy leaned back against a bundle of reeds beside his father. Nearby, two elderly workers spoke quietly about flood levels from many years before. One remembered seasons when the Nile rose too little and crops struggled badly. Another spoke of sickness spreading through villages during years of poor harvest. Children listened to these conversations constantly. They learned early that life could change suddenly. Floods failed. Illness arrived. Injuries happened. A family's survival often balanced delicately from season to season. Perhaps this was one reason ancient people prepared children for adulthood so early. There was little certainty ahead. The father closed his eyes briefly while resting. Deep lines marked the corners of his face now from years beneath the sun. His hands looked rough and cracked from endless labor. The boy studied those hands quietly. One day his own would likely look the same. This understanding did not frighten him exactly. It simply felt natural. Children became adults by slowly stepping into the visible lives already surrounding them. No great separation existed between generations. The future stood directly in front of them every day. After resting, the workers returned once more beneath the blazing afternoon heat. The hours moved slowly. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Insects drifted lazily above standing water near the channels. A distant ox groaned while pulling a heavy plow through wet earth. The rhythm of labor continued steadily beneath the endless sun. And all across the ancient world, in villages beside rivers and roads and crowded cities, children kept learning the same quiet lesson day after day. Life was waiting for them already. Not later. Not after many protected years. But now, slowly, with every sunrise over the Nile. Evening returned slowly across the Nile Valley. The terrible heat of afternoon loosened its grip little by little while shadows stretched long across the fields. Workers straightened aching backs and wiped dust from tired faces. The river reflected soft gold beneath the lowering sun, and for a brief hour the world seemed gentler again. The boy walked home beside his father through the warm fading light. Neither spoke very much. Their bodies were too tired for long conversation after the day's labor. Sandals brushed softly against the dry road while insects hummed low among the reeds nearby. Ahead, smoke rose from the village cooking fires. The smell of bread drifted through the evening air. Somewhere farther down the path, children chased one another lazily between date palms while mothers called them home before darkness settled fully across the land. The boy watched them quietly. Very young children still found small spaces for play wherever they could. A smooth stone could become a game. A stick dragged through dirt could become a drawing. Bits of broken pottery became toys in dusty streets beside sleeping dogs and baskets of drying fish. But childhood games rarely lasted long before duties returned again. A little girl carrying water might stop briefly to laugh with friends beside the riverbank, then continue home balancing the heavy jar carefully against her shoulder. A boy helping repair fishing nets might joke quietly with his brothers before returning to the endless untangling of wet rope beneath the heat. Work surrounded everything. Still, moments of softness existed within it. As the father and son entered the village, they passed an elderly woman sitting outside her doorway weaving reeds into mats. Her fingers moved slowly now with age, but the motions remained steady after a lifetime of repetition. Beside her sat two small grandchildren watching carefully. One little boy tried clumsily to copy her movements using loose reeds scattered on the ground. The old woman smiled faintly but corrected his hands with gentle patience. This too was ancient childhood. Learning through watching. Through imitation. Through daily closeness to adult labor. No formal lesson was announced. No special moment separated teaching from ordinary life. Children absorbed knowledge almost constantly simply by remaining near older generations. The evening air cooled further as darkness slowly gathered. Goats settled into small enclosures beside homes. Donkeys stood quietly in narrow lanes while neighbors exchanged tired greetings before disappearing indoors for the night meal. The boy entered the house behind his father. Inside, the room glowed softly from firelight. His mother stirred lentils inside a clay pot while the older sister shaped fresh dough for tomorrow morning's bread. The youngest children sat near the wall already sleepy from the long warm day. The house smelled comforting. Smoke. Warm grain. Dust. Cooked onions. A faint scent of river mud still clinging to sandals near the doorway. The father sat heavily onto a low stool and stretched sore legs carefully. The boy lowered himself beside the wall, feeling the deep exhaustion spreading slowly through his arms and shoulders. Ancient life demanded physical tiredness almost every day. People slept deeply not because life was peaceful, but because their bodies had little strength left by nightfall. The family ate together quietly. Simple food filled most ordinary Egyptian meals. Bread remained the center of life for rich and poor alike. Lentils, onions, dates, fish, and beer made from grain appeared often on common tables. Meat existed more rarely for ordinary workers, usually during festivals or special occasions. Children learned early not to waste food. Every harvest depended upon successful floods. Every loaf of bread represented labor stretching across entire seasons. The youngest sister leaned sleepily against her mother while chewing small pieces of bread. Her eyes kept drifting closed before opening again. The boy watched her. Right now she still lived mostly within softness and care. Her responsibilities remained small. But even she would soon begin helping more each year. Sweeping floors. Fetching water. Grinding grain. Watching younger children. Childhood moved gradually, but steadily. Outside, night settled fully over the village. The Nile became invisible beyond the darkness, though its presence could still be felt nearby through the cool dampness drifting softly through the air. Frogs croaked near the riverbanks. Insects sang endlessly beneath the stars. After eating, the father spoke quietly about an upcoming journey to a nearby market town several hours south along the river. A merchant there needed laborers to help unload shipments arriving by boat. The work would last several days. The boy would come too. He listened carefully while his mother nodded. Travel was tiring, but extra grain payment mattered. Many ancient families lived close to hardship even during good years. Extra work meant extra food stored for difficult seasons ahead. The boy felt both nervous and curious. He had visited towns before, but larger river markets still seemed enormous and confusing to him. Boats from distant places arrived carrying strange goods, unfamiliar accents, and travelers who smelled of dust, spices, fish, leather, and long roads beneath the sun. For children growing up in villages, markets offered rare glimpses of wider worlds beyond the familiar fields. The family slowly prepared for sleep afterward. The fire burned lower. The younger children curled beneath linen blankets. The mother checked the grain jars carefully one last time before lying down beside the others. Outside, the village became quiet. Only faint footsteps remained now and then along the narrow roads. The boy stared upward into darkness for a while before sleep came. He thought about the coming journey south along the Nile. About boats, crowded docks, merchants, strange faces. The ancient world could feel both very small and very large at the same time. Most ordinary people rarely traveled far from home. Yet rivers, trade roads, and caravans still connected distant lands slowly together. And children noticed these connections with wonder whenever they appeared nearby. Before dawn arrived the next morning, the family woke once more. The house remained dark except for a small flickering flame near the oven. Outside, stars still covered the sky while cool wind moved softly through the village. The mother handed the father and son small bundles of bread wrapped carefully in linen cloth for the journey ahead. Then they stepped outside together into the darkness. Several other workers waited nearby already. A few carried tools. Others led donkeys loaded with empty baskets meant for hauling cargo from the docks. Nobody spoke loudly. Morning travel often began in silence. The group followed the river southward beneath fading stars. The Nile flowed beside them like black glass in the darkness. Occasionally the surface reflected pale moonlight between drifting patches of mist. Palm trees stood motionless along the shore while distant birds cried softly from hidden reeds. The boy walked steadily beside his father. The road felt cool beneath his sandals for now. Soon the sun would rise again, bringing heat back across the valley. After some time, the eastern horizon slowly brightened. Gray turned to pale gold. Shapes emerged from darkness little by little. Farmhouses, palm groves, fishing boats tied near shore. Children already carrying water jars toward the river. Even this early, life had begun again everywhere along the Nile. As the sun finally rose, the travelers reached a wider stretch of river where larger boats moved steadily through the morning light. Some carried grain. Others transported stone blocks, timber, pottery, or woven cloth from distant towns. The market settlement appeared ahead gradually. Low buildings clustered beside wooden docks crowded with movement. Smoke drifted upward from ovens while merchants shouted softly across the water to arriving boats. The smell reached them before they fully arrived. Fish drying in the sun. Warm mud. Animals. Sweat. Bread baking nearby. River water thick with reeds and boats. The boy stared quietly at everything around him. To a village child, the market seemed busy beyond imagination. People from different regions moved through narrow streets carrying goods balanced on shoulders or loaded onto donkeys. Some wore cleaner linen than ordinary farmers. Others looked rough from long travel beneath desert dust. Children worked everywhere here too. Young boys carried baskets through crowded paths. Girls sold bread beside ovens. Apprentices swept workshop floors while craftsmen shouted instructions over hammering tools. A child standing idle too long quickly drew attention. The father and the other laborers soon joined dock workers unloading cargo from a large river boat newly arrived from the north. The work was exhausting immediately. Heavy sacks of grain passed from shoulder to shoulder beneath the growing heat. The boy helped carry smaller loads toward nearby storage rooms while trying carefully not to stumble among the crowded workers. Around him, the dock pulsed with constant motion. Ropes tightened. Wood creaked. Men called instructions. Water slapped softly against boat hulls. Birds circled overhead waiting for scraps near the fish cellars. The smell of the river mixed with sweat and dust beneath the brightening sky. The boy's arms soon burned from effort. Still he continued. Nearby, another worker's son, perhaps only a year older, carried twice as much weight without complaint. His face already looked older somehow, hardened slightly by years of labor beneath the sun. Many ancient children matured physically and emotionally very quickly because daily life demanded it. There was little separation between the growing body and the working body. As the hours passed, the market became hotter and louder. Yet beneath the noise, routines remained strangely calm. People knew their tasks. Boats arrived. Cargo moved. Bread baked. Fish dried. Scribes counted shipments beneath shaded awnings. The rhythm repeated endlessly day after day. At midday, the workers rested briefly beneath a woven shelter near the docks. The boy sat beside his father eating bread slowly while watching river traffic drift past. A nearby merchant argued quietly with a scribe over grain measurements while two exhausted boys slept against stacked baskets only a few steps away. Even rest often happened beside work itself. The father drank water carefully before speaking. He explained how a river trade connected all of Egypt together. Grain from one region fed another. Stone traveled south and north for temples and tombs. Papyrus, linen, fish, oil, and pottery moved constantly along the Nile's long winding path. The boy listened closely. Knowledge mattered too, even among laborers. Children learned geography not from maps, but from rivers, roads, stories, and cargo arriving from places they might never see themselves. Beyond the docks, sunlight shimmered across the Nile in endless motion. The afternoon heat pressed heavily upon the crowded market. And all around them, ancient childhood continued quietly beneath the burden of preparation, carrying boys and girls steadily toward the long working lives waiting ahead. The afternoon drifted slowly across the crowded river market. Heat pressed down upon the wooden docks until the boards themselves felt warm beneath bare feet and worn sandals. The air shimmered above the riverbanks. Workers moved more slowly now, conserving strength beneath the heavy Egyptian sun. The boy wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm and lifted another grain sack carefully onto his shoulder. Dust clung to his skin. His arms trembled faintly from exhaustion. Yet around him, adults continued working with steady patience shaped by many years of labor. Their movements wasted little energy. They understood how to survive long days beneath the heat. Children learned this too. Not through lectures or formal instruction, but through watching bodies move. Watching how older workers bent their knees while lifting. How they rested briefly in narrow strips of shade. How they drank water slowly instead of too quickly. The knowledge of survival passed quietly through observation. Near the edge of the dock, a group of boys untangled thick river ropes while an older sailor supervised nearby. Their fingers moved quickly through rough fibers darkened by water and age. One boy worked silently despite a fresh blister split open across his palm. The sailor noticed. Without much ceremony, he handed the child a scrap of linen cloth for wrapping the wound before returning immediately to work again. Small injuries were common in ancient childhood. Cuts, burns, splinters. bruises, sun sickness, infections. Bodies endured constant strain from labor, weather, rough tools, poor sanitation, and exhaustion. Yet ordinary families had little ability to pause for recovery unless illness became severe. The rhythm of work rarely stopped. The boy carried another load toward the storage rooms beside the docks. Inside, the air smelled of grain dust and warm clay walls. Large jars lined the darkened room while scribes sat nearby recording incoming shipments with careful concentration. One young apprentice scribe dipped his reed brush into black ink and copied symbols onto papyrus sheets stacked neatly beside him. He looked perhaps 13 years old. His linen clothing appeared cleaner than the dock workers' clothing outside, but his posture revealed a different kind of fatigue. His shoulders remained tense from hours bent over writing surfaces. The dock boy glanced at him with quiet fascination again. Literacy still seemed mysterious. The scribe apprentice noticed the stare and looked up briefly before lowering his eyes back toward the papyrus. Even children occupied different worlds within the same society. Some prepared for lives of physical labor. Others prepared for administration, religion, trade, or skilled crafts. Yet nearly all preparation began early. A child's future usually formed long before adulthood arrived. The storage room grew hotter by the hour. Outside, sunlight flooded the docks in blinding brightness while river water flashed silver beneath the afternoon sky. Boatmen shouted softly across the water while unloading jars of oil from another arriving vessel. The smell of fish drifted heavily through the market now. Nearby ovens baked fresh bread continuously for workers and travelers moving through town. Smoke rose into the hot air and disappeared slowly above the river. At last, near late afternoon, the labor slowed slightly. The father sat beside a shaded wall with the other workers while the boy stretched aching arms carefully. His entire body felt heavy now. An older laborer nearby chuckled softly and said the soreness would become easier after enough years. The others smiled faintly. Not mocking. Simply knowing. The boy listened quietly. Many children in the ancient world spent much time near adults rather than separated into age groups. They heard conversations about harvests, injuries, taxes, droughts, marriages, river conditions, and debts from very early ages. Because of this, childhood often carried an unusual seriousness. Children understood practical realities early because those realities surrounded them constantly. A nearby worker removed his sandals and rubbed tired feet slowly. Deep cracks marked his heels from years walking hot roads and wet fields. Beside him sat his daughter, perhaps 9 years old, eating bread quietly while leaning against stacked cargo baskets. She had spent the afternoon helping her mother sell vegetables along the market road. Tomorrow she would likely return again. The father looked at the girl with tired affection before handing her the last small piece of onion from his meal. Simple gestures carried great tenderness in hard lives. Ancient families loved their children deeply, though that love often appeared through work, sacrifice, and survival rather than long verbal affection. Feeding a child. Teaching a skill. Sharing water during heat. Saving grain for difficult seasons. These acts mattered greatly. As evening approached, shadows stretched across the market roads. The worst heat finally began to fade. Workers moved with visible relief now while river breezes returned softly from the north. Merchants lowered awnings against the setting sun. Boats rocked gently beside the docks as unloading slowed for the day. The father stood again. There would still be more work tomorrow, but now they could rest. The boy followed him through the evening streets toward a crowded lodging courtyard where traveling workers often slept during short stays in town. The courtyard walls trapped the warmth of the day inside them. Several small cooking fires flickered near the edges while tired laborers sat eating simple meals from clay bowls. The smell of lentils and baked bread filled the air. Donkeys rested nearby chewing slowly beside loaded baskets. A few children already slept against folded blankets despite the noise around them. Exhaustion allowed sleep almost anywhere. The father found an open space near the far wall. There they spread thin blankets across the ground beside several other workers from nearby villages. The boy lowered himself carefully, muscles aching from shoulders to feet. Above them, the evening sky deepened slowly into darkness. Voices drifted softly through the courtyard. Someone coughed. Someone laughed quietly at a story almost too tired to finish. A woman nearby soothed a crying infant while stirring a small pot over the fire. The atmosphere felt strangely peaceful despite the crowded conditions. In the ancient world, privacy was rare for ordinary people. Life unfolded closely together. Families slept beside one another. Workers traveled in groups. Children remained near adults almost constantly. The modern idea of separate private worlds barely existed for most people. The boy lay on his back watching stars appear overhead. His father sat nearby speaking quietly with another laborer about river taxes and crop predictions for the coming season. The boy listened while sleep slowly pulled at his eyes. Conversations about survival shaped childhood naturally. Children learned which flood levels brought good harvests, which illnesses spread during summer heat, which officials demanded heavy grain taxes, which roads became dangerous during sandstorms. Practical knowledge mattered deeply. Nearby, another boy perhaps 15 years old sharpened a bronze fishing hook beside the firelight. His younger brother watched carefully while fighting sleep. The older boy explained how certain fish stayed deeper during warmer months and how damaged hooks could lose entire catches. Again, another lesson passed quietly between generations. Not formal. Not ceremonial. Simply woven into ordinary life. The fires burned lower as night deepened. The courtyard slowly quieted. Bodies settled against blankets and woven mats while distant river sounds drifted softly through the darkness. The boy's eyes closed. Tomorrow would begin before sunrise again. And somewhere beyond this market town, beyond the river itself, other children across the ancient world were also falling asleep after long days of preparation. In dusty Mesopotamian cities, boys rested beside brick-making yards where they had spent the day shaping wet clay beneath the heat. In small Greek villages, girls slept after grinding grain and carrying water from hillside springs. In Roman farming towns centuries later, children drifted toward sleep exhausted from vineyard labor, kitchen smoke, and crowded streets. Across cultures and centuries, childhood remained deeply tied to responsibility. Not because ancient people lacked tenderness, but because survival demanded participation from nearly everyone. Long before dawn returned, the courtyard slowly stirred awake again. A worker rose quietly to relight cooking embers. Somebody groaned softly while stretching sore muscles. The smell of smoke returned. The boy opened his eyes to darkness and blinking firelight. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then he heard the river nearby. The creaking boats. The distant voices from early fishermen already awake along the docks. And memory returned gently. The father handed him a piece of bread left from the night before. Cool air moved through the courtyard while workers gathered their tools in silence. Beyond the walls, the market town still slept mostly beneath the stars. Yet life along the Nile had already begun again. The boy followed his father back toward the docks through dim narrow streets. Cats slipped quietly between storage buildings searching for scraps. A lone baker worked beside glowing ovens while shaping dough in warm firelight. The smell of fresh bread drifted into the cold morning air. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared nets beneath lantern glow. The Nile looked black beneath the fading night sky. Mist floated low above the water again, soft and silent. The boy paused briefly beside the shore. For a moment everything felt calm. No shouting merchants yet. No heavy lifting. Only water moving endlessly through darkness. Ancient childhood contained moments like this too. Small pauses between labor. Moments of stillness beside rivers, fields, workshops, and roads before the day fully awakened. Then the sky slowly brightened once more. The first pale gold touched the eastern horizon. Birds cried overhead. And the crowded machinery of ancient daily life began turning again, carrying children steadily forward into the long adult world waiting patiently for them beside the Nile. Morning light spread slowly across the river market. The first sunlight touched the tops of moored boats and painted the Nile with pale gold that trembled softly across the moving water. Cool air still lingered between the storage buildings and narrow streets, though everyone knew the heat would return soon enough. The boy followed his father onto the docks once more. Already the market had begun waking around them. Bakers carried fresh loaves from smoking ovens. Fishermen sorted silver-scaled catches into woven baskets. Merchants unrolled linen coverings from their stalls while sleepy apprentices swept dust from the roads before customers arrived. The entire town seemed to rise gradually like a living thing stretching awake beside the river. The boy breathed deeply. The morning smelled different from evening. Cool mud from the riverbank. Fresh bread. Damp rope. Smoke from newly lit fires. Fish still wet from the Nile. For a short while, before the crowds thickened and the heat settled over everything, the market felt almost peaceful. Along the docks, sailors prepared boats for departure. Some vessels would travel north with the current. Others waited for favorable winds to carry them southward against the river's flow. Large linen sails hung loosely in the still morning air while crews loaded jars, baskets, bundles of papyrus reeds, and sacks of grain into crowded cargo spaces. Children worked among all of it. One young girl carried clay cups of watered beer to laborers unloading fish crates. A boy no older than 10 balanced a basket of onions carefully through the narrow spaces between workers. Two brothers dragged coils of rope across the dock while trying not to stumble over uneven boards. Nobody seemed surprised to see children there. Their presence belonged naturally to the rhythm of labor. The father and son joined a group assigned to unload stone blocks from a heavy cargo boat newly arrived from farther south. The stones were not enormous like those used for royal monuments, but they still required careful handling. The older workers positioned wooden rollers beneath each block while younger laborers carried tools and cleared space along the dock. The boy worked steadily despite sore muscles lingering from the previous day. Ancient children often lived with constant physical tiredness once they entered regular labor. Their bodies adapted slowly over years of repetition. Hands hardened. Feet toughened. Shoulders strengthened. The transformation from child to worker happened gradually, almost invisibly, beneath the daily routines of survival. As the morning brightened, more people flooded into the market streets. Voices rose around the docks. Donkeys brayed impatiently. Merchants called prices across crowded lanes. Scribes sat beneath shaded awnings recording transactions while guards watched quietly from temple storehouses nearby. The boy noticed how carefully everyone depended upon counting. Counting grain sacks. Counting fish baskets. Counting pottery jars. The ancient world relied deeply upon memory and record-keeping because survival itself depended upon stored food, taxes, and trade. Children learned numbers early even if they never learned formal writing. Mistakes could mean hunger later. Near the edge of the dock, an older woman sat weaving sandals from reeds while two small girls beside her practiced clumsy versions with leftover scraps. Their tiny fingers struggled to pull the fibers tightly enough together. The woman corrected them patiently. Again and again. The girls sighed softly but continued trying. Patience was expected. Preparation took years. The boy watched briefly before returning to work. Nearby, another laborer's son accidentally dropped a wooden tool into the river with a loud splash. For a moment the dock workers froze. Then several men laughed quietly while the embarrassed child stared helplessly at the drifting tool disappearing into the current. The boy's father only shook his head and handed the child another tool without anger. Children made mistakes. Adults expected them to. But they also expected improvement through repetition. Ancient childhood could be strict, yet it often carried an understanding that skill emerged slowly through long practice. The sun climbed higher. Warmth spread across the market roads. Sweat darkened linen clothing while dust began sticking to damp skin once again. The cool softness of dawn disappeared beneath the growing brightness. The boy carried smaller stone tools toward a nearby work area beside the warehouses. There, a group of craftsmen repaired damaged cargo crates using wood, rope, and bronze nails. Inside the shaded workshop, the air smelled of sawdust and warm timber. An elderly carpenter sat cross-legged shaping wooden boards carefully with worn tools polished smooth by decades of use. Beside him worked two apprentices, both boys perhaps 13 or 14 years old. Their movements remained cautious and deliberate under the old man's watchful eyes. One apprentice shaved rough wood too quickly and cut unevenly along the edge. The carpenter stopped him immediately. Not harshly. Just firmly. Then he guided the boy's hand slower across the blade while explaining something quietly. The dock boy lingered near the doorway for a moment watching. There was something calming about the old craftsman's patience. Outside, the market rushed endlessly with noise and movement. Inside, the workshop moved at the pace of careful hands. Children entered skilled trades slowly like this. Year after year. Watching. Repeating. Failing. Trying again. Many apprentices lived difficult lives filled with long hours and strict discipline, yet learning a skilled craft could bring more stability than ordinary labor in the fields. Parents often hoped their children might enter respected trades if opportunity appeared. Still, opportunity remained uneven. Most children simply followed the labor already surrounding them from birth. The father called for the boy outside again. Another boat had arrived. Work resumed beneath the strengthening heat. The hours passed slowly. The dock grew louder and hotter as midday approached. River water flashed painfully bright beneath the sun while flies gathered near fish stalls along the market road. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads and necks against the heat. Some children looked exhausted now, their faces dusty and eyes heavy from carrying loads through crowded streets. Yet the market continued moving. Always moving. The father finally rested beside stacked grain jars beneath a narrow strip of shade. The boy sat beside him breathing hard while drinking carefully from a shared water jar. Nearby, several workers discussed rumors of low flood levels farther south this year. Their voices carried quiet concern. The Nile controlled nearly every part of Egyptian survival. Too much flooding damaged homes and storage buildings. Too little flooding threatened crops. Children grew up hearing adults speak about the river almost like a living force with moods and intentions of its own. The boy listened carefully. He already understood that good flood years meant fuller grain jars at home. Bad years meant worry. Perhaps hunger. The adults never hid these realities completely from children. Life's uncertainty remained visible everywhere. A nearby laborer leaned against the wall, rubbing his shoulder painfully. Years of lifting and carrying had worn his body down slowly. Beside him sat his young son, perhaps only 8 years old, trying to copy the way older workers wrapped cloth around sore joints. The sight felt strangely tender. Children watched adulthood approaching them every day. Not from far away, but directly beside them. The heat deepened further. By midday, the entire market seemed wrapped in shimmering brightness. Dogs slept beneath carts. Donkeys stood motionless beside walls. Even voices grew slower beneath the heavy air. The boy's father purchased a small bowl of lentils and bread from a nearby food cellar, and they ate quietly together beside the riverbank. The Nile moved past endlessly before them. Boats drifted slowly through sunlight. Reeds bent gently along the shore. For a few moments, the father spoke softly about his own childhood. He had begun field work younger than the boy. By 10 years old he already spent full days helping repair irrigation channels after floods. His own father had done the same before him. The boy listened carefully. Stories about childhood were rarely sentimental in the ancient world. People remembered hardship plainly because hardship shaped ordinary life. Yet there was calm acceptance in the father's voice too. Work connected generations together. The father pointed toward the river. As long as the Nile continued flowing, families would continue working beside it. Children would continue learning. The pattern would repeat again and again. The boy stared at the water quietly. Sunlight danced across the current in soft shifting lines. Somewhere upriver, other children were carrying water jars through villages now. Some were grinding grain beside mothers and sisters. Some were herding goats along dusty paths. Some sat inside temple schools carefully copying symbols beneath the watch of strict teachers. All across the ancient world, childhood moved steadily toward usefulness. Not because imagination or play disappeared entirely, but because survival stood close beside every family. A warm breeze drifted across the riverbank carrying the smell of wet reeds and distant cooking fires beginning preparations for the evening meal. The workers slowly stood again. There was still more labor ahead before sunset finally arrived. And beneath the endless Egyptian sky, the boy rose beside his father once more, stepping quietly back into the great slow rhythm of ancient life along the Nile. The afternoon sun hung heavily above the Nile. Its brightness covered the market town in a pale golden haze that softened the edges of buildings, boats, and distant palms. Heat rose from the stone roads and wooden docks in slow shimmering waves. Even the river itself seemed quieter now beneath the weight of the day. The boy followed his father back toward the crowded unloading platforms. His legs ached from standing. His shoulders burned from lifting baskets and tools since dawn. Yet around him, labor continued steadily without complaint. An old sailor tightened ropes along the edge of a cargo boat with slow practiced movements. Nearby, 2 women carried jars balanced carefully against their hips while speaking softly together through tired smiles. A young apprentice hurried across the dock carrying writing supplies for a scribe seated beneath a woven shade canopy. The market moved like a great living machine powered by thousands of ordinary hands. Children's hands among them. The father's group had been assigned to move pottery jars from a newly arrived boat into nearby storage rooms. The jars held oil and dried grain sealed beneath waxed cloth coverings. The work required caution. One broken jar could waste precious food. The boy crouched carefully while lifting the smaller containers onto wooden sledges that workers dragged across the dock. The clay felt warm beneath his palms from the afternoon heat. Dust clung to everything now. To sandals. To clothing. To sweat-covered skin. To the fine hairs along tired arms. The entire ancient world often seemed coated in dust and river mud. Children grew used to it early. As the work continued, the boy noticed a small child sleeping beneath a market stall nearby. The little boy could not have been older than 4 or 5. He rested curled against a basket of onions while his mother sold vegetables only a few steps away. Even very small children spent much of life close to adult workspaces. There were few separate places meant only for childhood. Babies slept beside ovens. Toddlers played beside fishing nets. Young children wandered among workshops and fields while older relatives watched them loosely between tasks. Life remained shared and visible. The boy remembered his own earliest years only faintly now. Warm nights beside the cooking fire. The sound of grain grinding before dawn. His mother carrying him while walking toward the river. The smell of bread baking inside the house. Even those early memories were tied closely to work and routine. The market noise drifted around him endlessly. Voices rose and faded. A donkey brayed impatiently. Fish sellers called softly to passing customers. Bronze tools rang faintly from nearby workshops. The sounds blended together into a slow, steady rhythm beneath the heat. Ancient cities and markets were rarely silent during daylight hours, yet their noise felt different from modern noise. No engines. No machines roaring endlessly. Only human movement. Human labor. Human voices carried through open air beneath the sun. The father paused briefly beside the river to wash dust from his hands. The boy joined him. The Nile water felt cool and soft against overheated skin. For a moment they stood quietly watching boats drift past. One long narrow vessel moved southward with its linen sail stretched wide in the afternoon breeze. Another heavy cargo boat floated north with the current, low in the water beneath stacked grain sacks. The father pointed toward the southern horizon. Far beyond sight, the river continued through countless villages, temples, and fields where families lived much the same way. Children woke before dawn. Workers bent over fields. Women baked bread. Fishermen cast nets into dark morning water. The patterns repeated endlessly along the Nile. The boy listened without speaking. Sometimes his father explained things this way. Quietly. Not as formal lessons, but as thoughts shared during moments of rest. The boy sensed that understanding the river meant understanding life itself. Everything depended upon it. The workers returned to labor again as afternoon slowly leaned toward evening. The worst heat began easing little by little. Shadows lengthened across the docks. The market's energy softened. Some merchants packed unsold goods into baskets while others prepared evening meals beside small cooking fires. Children looked especially tired now. A young girl nearly stumbled while carrying clay cups through the crowd before her older brother steadied her gently. 2 apprentice boys sat against a warehouse wall sharing bread in complete silence, too exhausted even for conversation. The dock boy felt the same heaviness settling into his own body. Ancient childhood often meant living close to physical limits. Children learned early what tiredness truly felt like. Not occasional tiredness, but deep daily exhaustion carried through growing years. And yet life continued. Evening approached at last. The sky softened from bright white into pale gold and dusty orange above the river. Birds circled low over the water before disappearing into reeds along the shore. The father's work group finally finished unloading the final cargo jars. Tomorrow they would begin the journey back toward their village. The thought brought relief to the boy. The market fascinated him, but its endless noise and crowded movement also felt overwhelming after several days. He missed the quieter rhythm of home. The slower evenings. The familiar riverbank. The smell of his mother's bread inside the dim mud brick house. As workers began leaving the docks, the father and son walked slowly through the market streets together. Now the town changed character completely. The harsh brightness of day faded. Cooking fires glowed warmly beside homes and stalls. Smoke drifted upward into the cooling air. The smell of lentils, roasting onions, and fresh bread spread through the streets while tired laborers searched for evening meals. A flute player sat beside a wall near the river road, playing soft wandering notes that floated gently through the evening warmth. Nearby, children gathered briefly around him while their parents prepared food or packed market goods away for the night. The music felt calm, unhurried. The boy slowed slightly to listen. For a few moments, the entire street seemed softer beneath the fading light. An old woman smiled while feeding scraps of bread to stray dogs near the corner of a storage building. Two brothers argued sleepily over a clay toy beside their family's stall before their mother separated them with tired patience. Small ordinary moments. Quiet moments. The kind that filled most human lives far from kings and monuments. The father purchased a small bundle of dried fish for the journey home tomorrow. Then they returned toward the crowded lodging courtyard once more. Night gathered slowly overhead. Stars appeared one by one above the darkening Nile. The courtyard already held many weary workers preparing for sleep. Some sat beside fires eating their final meal of the day. Others rubbed sore legs and shoulders while speaking softly together. Children drifted toward sleep quickly now. One small boy slept with his head resting against a grain sack while his older sister carefully covered him with linen cloth. The dock boy sat beside his father near the wall. They ate quietly. Bread. Fish. A few dates. Simple food after a long day. Nearby, a traveling merchant spoke about distant desert roads where caravans crossed endless sand carrying incense, copper, and fine cloth between kingdoms. Several workers listened with quiet interest while staring into the firelight. The boy listened too. The ancient world stretched far beyond the Nile, though most ordinary people rarely traveled far enough to see it themselves. Still, stories traveled. Children grew up hearing about distant lands through merchants, sailors, soldiers, and wandering craftsmen passing through towns beside the river. The merchant described dry winds blowing across red desert hills. Long nights beneath open stars. Camels moving silently through moonlit sand. The boy imagined it while the fire crackled softly nearby. Yet even these distant stories returned eventually to practical matters. Trade. Food. Survival. Roads. Water. The concerns of ordinary life remained everywhere. The fires burned lower as the night deepened. The courtyard quieted little by little. Bodies settled onto blankets across the hard ground while distant market sounds faded into stillness. The boy lay beside his father staring upward. The stars above Egypt looked endless tonight. Bright and cold above the warm sleeping town. He thought about home again. Tomorrow they would walk north beside the Nile. Back past fields and palms. Back toward the quiet village waking before dawn each morning. Back toward the familiar rhythm waiting for them there. His eyes grew heavy. Nearby, someone coughed softly in sleep. A donkey shifted against its tether rope. Then silence returned gently. Beyond the courtyard walls, the Nile moved through darkness exactly as it always had, carrying boats, stories, labor, and generations of children steadily forward beneath the ancient Egyptian sky. Before sunrise, the market town rested in deep silence. The fires in the lodging courtyard had burned down to faint glowing embers. Most workers still slept beneath thin blankets spread across the hard ground. The air felt cool for the first time in many hours, and a soft river breeze drifted quietly through the open gate. The boy woke slowly. For a few moments he watched the dark shapes around him without moving. A man nearby snored softly beside stacked baskets. Someone coughed in the distance. Beyond the walls, he could hear faint water sounds from the Nile moving through the darkness. The ancient world often felt most peaceful during these quiet moments before dawn. The day's labor had not yet begun. The heat had not yet arrived. Even crowded places seemed calm beneath the fading stars. Beside him, his father was already awake. He sat quietly tying worn sandals while watching the eastern horizon slowly lighten beyond the rooftops. The boy sat up and rubbed tired eyes. Today they would return home. The thought carried a deep feeling of relief through his exhausted body. The market town had shown him many things. The endless movement of boats. The crowded docks. The noise of merchants and laborers working beneath the sun. But home waited beside the quieter stretch of river farther north, where life moved more slowly and every road felt familiar. The father handed him a piece of leftover bread from the night before. It was hard now, but filling enough for the journey. Around them, the courtyard slowly began waking. Workers stretched sore backs. Women relit cooking fires. Children blinked sleepily beneath blankets while parents gathered tools and baskets for travel. Nobody hurried. Ancient mornings unfolded gradually. The body needed time to wake after long days of labor. Outside the courtyard gate, the street still lay mostly empty. A baker worked alone beside glowing ovens while shaping fresh dough beneath flickering firelight. The smell drifted warmly through the cool air. Cats slipped silently between storage buildings searching for scraps left from yesterday's market. Farther away near the docks, fishermen already prepared boats beneath dim lantern glow. The boy followed his father through the quiet streets toward the northern road. The Nile appeared beside them again, dark and wide beneath the fading stars. Mist floated low above the water while reeds whispered softly along the shore. The sky slowly shifted from black to deep blue. Then pale silver. Then faint gold. The father and son walked steadily northward. Their sandals pressed softly into the dusty road while the river moved beside them in endless silence. Other travelers joined the road gradually as dawn approached. A farmer guiding 2 donkeys loaded with grain sacks. An old woman carrying woven mats toward a nearby village. A young mother walking carefully beside her husband while balancing a sleeping child against her shoulder. Children traveled often in the ancient world. Some moved with merchant caravans. Some followed families between villages during harvest seasons. Some journeyed long distances after marriage arrangements or labor opportunities. The road itself became part of childhood for many ordinary people. As sunlight finally touched the horizon, the land around them slowly awakened. Birds rose from the reeds. Palm trees glowed softly in the early light. Fields stretched green and black beside the riverbanks where farmers already began morning labor. The boy breathed deeply. The air smelled fresh now. Wet soil. River water. Cool reeds. Distant cooking fires beginning breakfast preparations. He had missed these familiar smells. The market town carried the scent of crowded bodies, fish, smoke, and dust trapped between narrow streets. Here the open river valley felt calmer. The father walked mostly in silence. Travel often encouraged quietness in ancient life. Long roads gave people time to think while conserving energy beneath the coming heat. The boy watched the landscape carefully as they moved northward. Small villages appeared beside the river every so often, each looking slightly different yet strangely familiar too. Mud brick homes. Palm groves. Children carrying water jars. Women baking bread beside outdoor ovens. Men leading animals toward fields. The same rhythms repeated again and again along the Nile. The boy realized something slowly while walking. Every village held children preparing for adulthood in nearly the same ways. Some learned fishing. Some learned farming. Some learned weaving, pottery, carpentry, or trade. But everywhere, childhood moved steadily toward usefulness. A little farther along the road, they passed a field where several boys worked beside an older farmer repairing a broken irrigation wall. Their feet and legs were coated in wet mud. One child struggled to lift heavy reeds into place while the others pressed clay carefully between cracks in the channel. The father nodded toward them quietly. That work could not wait. If the wall failed, water might flood unevenly during planting season. The boy understood. Children worked because life itself depended upon many small tasks being completed properly. Ancient survival often rested upon fragile systems. Water channels. Food storage. Fishing nets. Bread ovens. One broken piece could affect an entire household. The morning remained pleasant for a while longer. Soft wind moved across the riverbanks. Birdsong drifted from palms overhead. The road felt almost peaceful beneath the growing light. But by mid-morning, the heat slowly returned once again. The sun climbed higher. Dust rose beneath their sandals. Sweat gathered along the boy's neck and shoulders. They stopped briefly beside the river to drink water and rest beneath a patch of shade cast by date palms. Nearby, another traveling family rested too. A young girl, perhaps 7 years old, sat beside her grandmother weaving loose reeds together while listening to quiet conversation between the adults. Even during travel, learning continued. The grandmother corrected the child's fingers gently whenever the weaving became uneven. The girl sighed with frustration but kept trying carefully. The boy watched them while chewing dry bread slowly. Children rarely escaped preparation entirely. Daily life itself became the classroom. After resting, the travelers continued north. The river shimmered brightly now beneath the harsh sunlight. Fishermen drifted slowly across the water in narrow boats while farmers bent low over green fields along the banks. The father pointed toward distant workers carrying baskets across newly planted land. Soon their own village would begin similar work again. The flood season had ended. Planting season demanded enormous effort from entire communities. The boy listened quietly. Already he could feel the familiar weight of future labor waiting ahead at home. Yet strangely, the thought no longer felt unpleasant. The rhythms of work had become part of life itself. This happened gradually in ancient childhood. Responsibility stopped feeling temporary. Children slowly accepted labor as natural, expected, ordinary. By midday, the heat became difficult again. The travelers moved more slowly now. The road shimmered white beneath the sun while insects buzzed heavily among the reeds. They passed several workers resting beside the riverbank with feet submerged in shallow water to cool themselves before continuing onward. An elderly man slept beneath a palm tree with one arm across his face while his grandson watched nearby donkeys chewing lazily beside the road. Even moments of rest often included responsibility. The boy's own legs felt heavy now. His sandals rubbed painfully against sore feet from days spent on the docks. Still he continued walking beside his father without complaint. Ancient children learned endurance partly because complaining rarely changed circumstances. The road remained long whether one complained or not. Eventually the father slowed and pointed ahead. Far in the distance, beyond a curve in the river and clusters of palms, the faint outline of their village appeared. The boy felt immediate warmth inside his chest. Home. Even simple mud brick homes could inspire deep attachment after difficult travel. Home meant familiar voices, familiar smells, familiar silence at night beside the Nile. As they drew closer, details slowly emerged. Smoke rising from cooking fires. Children moving between narrow lanes. Goats gathered beside walls. The sound of grain grinding drifting softly through the afternoon air. The village looked almost unchanged. Ancient life often moved with remarkable continuity. One season resembled the next. One generation repeated many patterns from the generation before. The father and son entered the village beneath the blazing afternoon sun. Several neighbors greeted them with tired smiles and brief questions about the market town. Children stared curiously at the bundle of dried fish the father carried home from the journey. The boy felt suddenly aware of how dusty and exhausted he must look. His mother appeared in the doorway of their house. Relief softened her face immediately when she saw them return safely. Inside, the room smelled of warm bread and smoke from the cooking fire. The younger children gathered close around their father while the older sister prepared water for washing dust from their feet and hands. The boy sat quietly near the doorway while the familiar sounds of home surrounded him once more. Grinding stone. Soft voices. The crackle of fire. Outside, the Nile continued flowing beyond the village in endless motion beneath the afternoon sun. And somewhere along its banks, countless other children were still learning, little by little, how to step from childhood into the long demanding world of ancient adulthood. The village settled into evening slowly after the father and son returned home. The harsh brightness of afternoon softened into warm gold across the mud brick walls and narrow paths between homes. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires while the smell of baking bread drifted through the air once more. The boy sat quietly near the doorway of the house, letting his tired body rest at last. His younger siblings crowded close beside him, asking soft questions about the market town. Were the boats truly that large? Did merchants come from distant places? Did the docks smell as strongly of fish as people said? The boy answered slowly while rubbing sore hands together. He described the crowded riverbanks. The endless shouting of workers. The heavy cargo boats loaded with grain and stone. The younger children listened with wide sleepy eyes as evening deepened around them. For children growing up in small villages, stories from travelers carried great power. Most people would spend nearly all their lives close to the same stretch of river, the same fields, the same familiar roads. The wider world existed mostly through stories. And stories traveled slowly along the Nile. The mother stirred lentils above the fire while listening quietly. The older sister knelt nearby shaping dough with steady practiced hands. Already she moved like an adult in many ways, though traces of childhood still appeared whenever the younger children made her laugh unexpectedly. The boy watched her for a moment. He realized how quickly people changed. Only a few years earlier they had both spent more time playing beside the riverbank between chores. Now she carried much of the household labor beside their mother every day. Soon she might marry. Soon her life would belong partly to another household. Ancient childhood often disappeared gradually without anyone announcing its end. Responsibilities simply increased year after year until adulthood arrived almost unnoticed. Outside, the village road filled briefly with evening movement. Workers returned from distant fields carrying tools across tired shoulders. Fishermen unloaded final catches near the riverbank before darkness settled fully. Women gathered water while speaking softly together in the fading light. Children still wandered between homes for a little while longer before sleep. A group of boys kicked a woven ball gently through the dust near the edge of the village. Their laughter drifted softly through the warm evening air. The boy watched them quietly. Even older children still found moments for games when time allowed. But exhaustion often limited such energy after full days of work beneath the sun. Soon the game ended anyway. One child's father called from a doorway. Another boy was sent to help gather firewood before night. Little by little, the children disappeared indoors. The sky darkened slowly above the Nile. Purple shadows stretched across the riverbanks while the first stars emerged overhead. Insects hummed steadily among the reeds nearby. Inside the house, the family gathered for the evening meal. The father spoke quietly about the market journey while eating bread beside the firelight. He described grain prices, crowded docks, and rumors of flood levels farther south. The mother listened carefully. Such information mattered. A poor flood season could affect every family along the Nile months later. Children listened too. Ancient households rarely hid practical worries completely from the young. Food, weather, taxes, illness, and labor shaped everyone's lives together. The boy noticed how tired his father looked tonight. The journey and dock work had deepened the lines around his eyes. His hands moved slowly now while tearing bread into smaller pieces. Years of labor marked ancient bodies clearly. Bent backs. Rough skin. Scarred hands. Children saw adulthood written physically upon their parents every day. Perhaps this made growing older feel less mysterious. The future stood visible right in front of them. After the meal, darkness settled fully across the village. The cooking fire burned lower. Outside, the Nile became invisible beneath the night sky, though cool damp air drifting through the doorway still carried its presence into the room. The younger children fell asleep quickly beside the wall. The older sister continued mending worn linen clothing beside the fading firelight while the mother organized grain jars carefully for the coming days. Even evening contained labor. Work rarely ended entirely. The boy lay quietly on his blanket listening to the sounds around him. Soft breathing. The scrape of clay jars. Distant frogs near the river. Somewhere outside, footsteps passed slowly along the road before fading into silence again. Night in the ancient world could feel deeply peaceful after darkness fully arrived. Without bright lamps or endless activity, most villages settled quickly into stillness. People slept because they needed sleep desperately after physical labor stretching from dawn until sunset. The boy closed his eyes. Tomorrow the familiar routines would begin again. Before sunrise, the grain grinding. The morning fires. The walk toward the fields. The endless movement of work beneath the sun. And so it happened. Long before dawn, he woke once more to the sound of his mother grinding grain in darkness. Stone against grain. Grain against stone. The rhythm filled the house softly while the rest of the village still slept. The boy remained beneath his blanket for a few moments listening. The sound felt comforting now. Familiar. Steady. Ancient childhood was filled with repeated sounds like this. Grinding stone. Flowing water. Crackling ovens. Hammering tools. Animals stirring before dawn. Children grew up inside these rhythms until they became part of memory itself. The boy finally sat up. The room glowed faintly from firelight while his mother and sister prepared the morning meal together. Outside, darkness still covered the Nile Valley. The father drank water quietly near the doorway before speaking. Today there would be work repairing fishing nets near the river. Recent catches had damaged several sections badly, and the fishermen needed extra hands before tomorrow's journey onto deeper water. The boy nodded. Every season carried different labor. Flood repairs, planting, harvesting, fishing, construction. The tasks changed, but work remained constant. After eating a small breakfast of bread and dates, the boy followed his father toward the riverbank. The air felt cool and damp before sunrise. Mist floated low across the Nile while fishermen gathered beside moored boats preparing tools and nets in near silence. Lantern flames flickered softly against the dark water. The atmosphere felt calm, sleepy. The river moved quietly beside them. Several older fishermen sat cross-legged repairing damaged nets while younger boys untangled ropes nearby. The work demanded patience more than strength. The father handed the boy a section of torn net and showed him where the fibers needed tightening. The boy's fingers moved carefully through the rough cord. Repair work often occupied children for many hours in ancient societies. Small hands proved useful for tasks requiring precision and patience. Nearby, an old fisherman spoke softly while teaching his grandson how to check for weak sections in the woven fibers. The child listened seriously despite still looking half asleep beneath the fading stars. Knowledge passed this way constantly, quietly, patiently, through shared labor. As dawn approached, the eastern horizon slowly brightened. Birds began calling from the reeds. The Nile changed from black to deep blue beneath the growing light. Fishermen prepared hooks, baskets, and small clay jars for the coming day while smoke from early cooking fires drifted across the riverbank from the waking village behind them. The boy continued repairing the net carefully. His fingers had grown more confident over the past year. Tasks that once seemed difficult now felt familiar. This was how ancient children slowly became adults. Not suddenly. Not through ceremonies alone. But through repetition. The body learned. The hands learned. The mind learned. And little by little, responsibility became ordinary. The sun finally rose above the horizon. Golden light spread across the river. The cool softness of dawn faded once more as warmth touched the fields and village roads. Soon the heat would deepen again. Soon workers across the Nile Valley would bend over fields, carry water, shape clay, grind grain, row boats, and lift stone beneath the endless Egyptian sky. And among them, children would continue learning the ancient slow rhythm of preparation, stepping day by day toward the lives already waiting for them beside the river. The morning sun rose gently over the Nile, spreading soft gold across the quiet water and the low mud brick homes of the village. For a little while, before the full heat arrived, the world felt calm and almost cool. Thin mist still floated above the reeds near the riverbank. Birds drifted low across the water searching for insects. Smoke from the first cooking fires rose slowly into the pale sky. The boy sat beside the fisherman repairing nets. His fingers moved steadily now through the rough fibers while older men worked nearby in silence. Every so often, someone pointed toward a weak knot or damaged section needing repair, and the younger workers leaned closer to study carefully. The smell of wet rope filled the morning air. River mud clung softly to the ground beneath them. A fisherman's small son, barely old enough to work properly, sat nearby untangling thin cords with deep concentration. His tiny fingers struggled sometimes, but nobody pushed him away. This was how learning began. Slowly. By sitting near the work itself. The father spoke quietly while checking a heavy net stretched across his knees. Tomorrow, several boats would travel farther north where fish gathered in deeper water near the reeds. The nets had to be strong enough to survive the pull of large catches and shifting currents. The boy listened carefully. Fishing along the Nile required knowledge gathered over many generations. Where fish gathered during flood season. How water levels changed near certain bends in the river. Which winds made rowing difficult. Which months brought stronger catches. Children growing up beside the Nile absorbed this information gradually simply by remaining close to adults. Nearby, one elderly fisherman hummed softly while working. The tune moved slowly, almost blending with the gentle sound of water against the boats. It was not a performance. Just quiet music to accompany tired hands during repetitive labor. Ancient work often carried sounds like this. Soft singing. Low conversation. Tools striking in steady rhythm. These sounds helped long hours pass beneath the heat. The sun climbed higher little by little. Warmth spread across the riverbank. The village behind them fully awakened now. Women carried water jars through narrow streets. Children swept dust from doorways. Farmers walked toward the fields with tools across their shoulders while donkeys moved slowly beside them. The entire village breathed with routine. The boy finished repairing one section of net and handed it back to the fisherman. His fingers felt sore from pulling rough cord tight again and again. Small red marks crossed his palms where the fibers had rubbed against skin. The old fisherman inspected the repair carefully before nodding with quiet approval. The boy felt a small warmth of pride inside himself. Ancient children received praise differently than many children today. Approval often appeared through trust. Through being given more responsibility. Through adults accepting the usefulness of one's labor. The fishermen soon carried repaired nets toward the boats while the younger boys gathered baskets and hooks nearby. The father stood slowly, stretching his back with visible stiffness. Years beside the river had worn his body heavily. The boy noticed these things more often now. The slow movements after sitting too long. The careful way older workers lifted heavy objects. The deep tiredness that settled into adults by evening each day. Ancient childhood rarely protected children from seeing physical hardship. They watched it constantly. A nearby fisherman coughed harshly into the morning air before wiping sweat from his face. Another worker rubbed aching knees while lowering baskets into a boat. The body itself became part of ancient education. Children learned what labor cost. By mid-morning, the warmth had deepened into heat once more. The fishermen prepared to leave before the sun climbed too high. Several narrow boats drifted gently beside the shore while workers loaded supplies carefully. Water jars. Hooks. Small baskets of bread and dried fish. Repair tools. The boy helped push one boat away from the muddy bank while the men climbed aboard. Oars dipped softly into the Nile. The boats moved slowly northward through the shimmering water while morning sunlight flashed across the current. The village grew quieter after their departure. Now most adults had already gone toward fields, workshops, or river labor. Only younger children and those managing household tasks remained along the narrow roads. The father motioned for the boy to follow him back toward home. There would be more work there before noon. There was always more work. As they walked through the village, the boy noticed his older sister outside beside the house grinding grain beneath the shade of a woven covering. Sweat already darkened the linen along her shoulders despite the early hour. Grinding grain consumed enormous amounts of time in ancient households. Women and girls repeated the motion daily for years. Push forward. Pull back. Again and again. The heavy stone slowly crushed grain into flour for bread. The father paused briefly to speak with the mother near the doorway. The boy carried several empty jars toward the river to refill them with water. This too formed part of ordinary childhood. Carrying water became one of the earliest regular tasks for many children. Water was needed constantly for cooking, cleaning, drinking, washing, and mixing clay or grain. The riverbank had grown busier now beneath the strengthening sun. Women knelt washing clothing against smooth stones while children filled jars carefully beside them. A group of boys splashed briefly in the shallow water before an older sister called them back sharply toward work. The boy lowered the clay jars into the river slowly. The Nile felt cool against his hands. For a moment he paused and watched sunlight move across the water. Boats drifted far in the distance now. Birds circled lazily above the reeds. The beauty of the river remained close to everyday life. People noticed it quietly between tasks, even during exhausting routines. A young girl nearby struggled to lift a heavy water jar onto her shoulder. Her mother stepped forward immediately to help steady the weight before the child continued carefully toward the village. The boy watched them disappear along the dusty path. Children learn strength slowly through necessity. No single moment marked the beginning of responsibility. Tasks simply increased year after year. He carried the filled jars home carefully. The weight pulled against his arms while cool droplets slid down the clay sides onto his hands. Inside the house, the mother prepared vegetables beside the fire while the older sister continued grinding grain with tired, steady movements. The younger children sat nearby shaping little figures from leftover mud and reeds while whispering stories to one another. Even play often copied adult life. Tiny clay boats. Little baskets. Small pretend ovens. Children practice the world surrounding them through games without fully realizing it. The father soon left again to assist another family repairing a damaged roof before the next flood season returned months later. The boy remained home helping where needed. He swept dust from the floor. Carried firewood. Watched the younger children while the mother prepared bread dough. The hours moved slowly beneath the growing heat. By noon, sunlight poured heavily through the doorway while the village roads outside became nearly empty beneath the worst of the day's warmth. Even animals sought shade now. Dogs slept beside walls. Goats rested silently near woven fences. The air itself seemed heavy and still. Inside the house, the family rested briefly after eating bread and lentils together. The younger children slept quickly. The older sister leaned against the wall closing tired eyes for a few moments while the mother mended worn clothing beside the dim firelight. The boy lay quietly listening to the afternoon silence outside. Only distant sounds drifted through the heat now. A donkey braying far away. Faint voices from another house. The soft movement of wind against the roof reeds. Afternoon rest mattered deeply in hot climates like Egypt. Workers woke early partly because the midday sun became difficult to endure for long periods. Life followed the rhythm of heat itself. As the hottest hours slowly passed, movement gradually returned to the village again. The father came home carrying fresh reeds for roof repairs. Children reappeared outside. Women gathered near ovens preparing the evening meal. The Nile shimmered bronze beneath the lowering sun. The boy stepped outside into the softer evening light. The road beneath his sandals still felt warm from the day's heat. Nearby, an old man sat telling quiet stories to several children gathered around him beside the riverbank. The boy moved closer and listened. The old man spoke about flood seasons long ago when the Nile rose so high that boats drifted close beside the village homes. He described fields disappearing beneath endless water and fishermen rowing through places usually dry beneath the sun. The younger children listened with wide eyes. Stories formed another important part of childhood in the ancient world. Not stories of fantasy alone, but stories carrying memory. Weather, floods, famines, journeys, family histories, practical lessons hidden gently inside remembered events. The old man's voice moved slowly beneath the evening sky while insects hummed softly among the reeds nearby. The boy sat quietly listening as darkness gradually approached once more beside the endless river. The old man's voice drifted softly through the evening air beside the Nile. The children sat close together near the riverbank while warm wind moved gently through the reeds around them. Above, the sky slowly darkened from dusty gold into deep blue, and the first evening stars began appearing over the quiet water. The old storyteller rested both hands upon his knees while speaking. His fingers looked bent and worn from many years of labor. Thick lines crossed his face from sun and age. Yet his eyes remained calm beneath the fading light. He spoke about a season long ago when sickness spread through villages along the Nile after flood waters stayed too long in the fields. Families carried water carefully. Fishermen avoided certain riverbanks. Mothers burned herbs inside homes while priests offered prayers beside temple walls. The children listened silently. Ancient childhood included stories about hardship as naturally as stories about joy. Illness, hunger, injury, and death remained close to everyday life. Children understood this early because they witnessed it around them. The old man did not speak dramatically. His voice stayed slow and steady like the river itself. He described how families cared for one another during difficult months. Neighbors shared grain when supplies ran low. Older children carried water for sick relatives. Women baked bread together when one household became too weak to manage alone. The boy listened carefully. These were the kinds of stories that shaped understanding in the ancient world. Not stories about heroes alone, but stories about endurance. About ordinary people continuing through hardship together. The air cooled further as darkness spread along the riverbanks. Nearby, several fishermen returned at last from deeper water. Their narrow boats glided quietly toward shore while lantern flames flickered beside nets and baskets inside the vessels. The children turned to watch. Men stepped carefully into the shallow water pulling boats onto muddy ground while younger boys hurried forward to help unload fish baskets. Even after long days, work continued into evening whenever necessary. The smell of fresh fish drifted through the cooling night air. The storyteller smiled faintly before rising slowly to his feet with visible stiffness. Several children hurried to steady his arm while he stood. The boy noticed this small gesture quietly. Children were expected to learn respect for elders very early. Older people carried memory, knowledge, experience. And though age often weakened the body, elderly family members still held important places within households and villages. The storyteller thanked the children softly before disappearing down the narrow road toward his home. The group slowly scattered afterward. Some children ran sleepily back toward waiting families. Others lingered beside the river a little longer while frogs croaked among the reeds nearby. The boy remained sitting quietly for a few moments. Across the Nile, darkness covered the far riverbank completely now. Only a few distant firelights glowed faintly through the night. The ancient world became very dark after sunset. Without lamps burning everywhere, villages settled into pools of soft firelight surrounded by enormous stretches of shadow and stars. The boy finally stood and returned home. Inside the house, the evening meal was nearly ready. The mother stirred lentils beside the fire while the older sister arranged fresh bread on a woven mat. The younger children already looked half asleep from the long warm day. The father sat near the doorway repairing a wooden tool handle beneath flickering firelight. Evening labor again. Always small tasks waiting to be completed. The boy sat beside him quietly. For a while they worked without speaking. The father scraped rough wood carefully smooth while the boy twisted loose cord into tighter rope for tomorrow's fishing work. The room smelled of smoke, bread, warm clay walls, and tired bodies after another long day. Outside, insects hummed steadily beneath the stars. Finally the father spoke softly. Tomorrow they would begin repairing part of the irrigation channels near the northern fields again. Some walls had weakened after recent water movement, and planting season depended upon proper repairs before the next flooding cycle months later. The boy nodded. He had expected as much. Life along the Nile followed endless cycles of preparation. Repairing. Planting. Harvesting. Storing. Repairing again. Children grew up inside these repeating rhythms until the passing seasons themselves became a kind of calendar written into the body. The family ate quietly together afterward. Bread. Lentils. A little dried fish left from the market journey. Simple food shared beneath dim firelight. The youngest child fell asleep before finishing her meal, her head slowly lowering against the mother's arm while everyone smiled faintly. The mother carried her gently onto the blankets near the wall. Tenderness existed constantly within these hard lives. Softness beside exhaustion. Care beside labor. Ancient parents often spent much of their energy simply protecting children from hunger, sickness, and danger long enough for adulthood to arrive. After eating, the father stepped outside briefly. The boy followed him into the cool night air. The village had grown very quiet now. Only faint voices drifted from distant houses. Somewhere near the riverbank, a dog barked once before silence returned again. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly with stars. The father looked toward the Nile for a long moment before speaking again. When he was younger, he said, the village had been smaller. Fewer homes. Fewer fields. The riverbanks farther north had once flooded more heavily during certain seasons. The boy listened carefully. Children often learned history not from written records, but from memory shared aloud by older generations. The father spoke about relatives now gone. An uncle lost to fever years before. A cousin injured during flood repairs. A grandmother who once baked bread for half the village during a difficult harvest season. The stories moved quietly beneath the stars. No great speeches. Just memory carried from one generation into the next. The boy realized slowly that adulthood meant carrying these memories too someday. Remembering who had lived. Who had worked. Who had struggled beside the Nile before him. After a while, they returned inside. The fire burned low now. The family prepared for sleep. Blankets spread across the floor. Clay jars covered for the night. Tools placed carefully beside the doorway for morning work. The boy lay down beside his younger brother while warm darkness filled the room. His body already felt heavy with sleep. Tomorrow would come early again. Before dawn, the grinding stone. The river. The fields. The endless work beneath the sun. Outside, the Nile continued flowing unseen through darkness. And across Egypt, countless other children drifted toward sleep beside cooking fires, workshops, fishing boats, crowded city streets, and quiet farming villages. Some dreamed of becoming scribes. Some imagined traveling farther along the river. Some simply slept too deeply from exhaustion to dream much at all. But almost all would wake before sunrise. And almost all would continue learning the same ancient lesson. That childhood was not separate from life's burdens. It was preparation for carrying them. Long before dawn arrived, the mother woke once more. The room remained dark except for faint embers glowing beside the oven. Carefully, So as not to wake the younger children too quickly, she began grinding grain again. Stone against grain. The familiar rhythm returned softly through the darkness. The boy opened his eyes slowly. Outside, the world remained silent beneath the stars. He could hear only the grinding stone, his father's breathing nearby, and somewhere beyond the village, the endless quiet movement of the Nile flowing patiently through the ancient night. The grinding stone moved steadily through the darkness. Push forward. Pull back. Again and again. The sound filled the small house softly before dawn while the rest of the village still slept beneath the stars. Fine grain dust floated through the dim air around the mother's hands, settling across her arms and clothing in pale layers. The boy lay quietly for a few moments listening. This sound had followed him through nearly every morning of his life. The grinding stone. The first fire crackling awake. The low movement of adults beginning work before sunrise. Ancient childhood unfolded inside these rhythms so completely that they became part of memory itself. The mother paused briefly to rub her wrists. Even simple motions became exhausting after years repeated daily. Grinding grain wore down shoulders, backs, elbows, and hands slowly over time. Many women spent countless hours each week bent over grinding stones preparing flour for bread. The older sister soon woke too. Without complaint, she moved beside the oven and began arranging dry reeds beneath yesterday's ashes to restart the fire. Tiny sparks flickered upward while smoke drifted softly through the room. Outside, darkness still covered the Nile Valley. The father rose quietly and stretched stiff muscles beside the doorway. His joints cracked softly in the silence. The boy noticed again how slowly older workers moved early in the morning before their bodies fully loosened from sleep. Years of labor left traces everywhere. The father drank water from a clay jar and looked toward the eastern horizon outside. Soon it would be time to leave for the irrigation repairs. The boy finally sat up. The floor beneath him still held warmth from yesterday's heat trapped inside the mud brick walls. Nearby, the younger children remained asleep beneath blankets, breathing softly beside one another. The house smelled of smoke, grain, and warm clay. Simple smells. Familiar smells. The smells of ordinary ancient life. The mother handed the boy a small piece of bread while preparing the morning meal. It was still dark outside when they ate together quietly. Nobody spoke much this early. Words often came later after the body fully woke. Outside, the village slowly stirred to life. A donkey shifted somewhere nearby. A baby cried briefly before falling silent again. Farther down the road, another household began grinding grain too, the faint rhythm carrying softly through the darkness. The father gathered tools near the doorway. Wooden shovels. Bundles of reeds. Rope for reinforcing weak sections of the irrigation walls. The boy helped carry what he could. Then together they stepped outside into the cool pre-dawn air. The sky above Egypt looked deep blue now with countless stars still shining overhead. A thin breeze moved through the palm trees while mist drifted low near the riverbank. Other workers appeared gradually along the village roads. Men carrying tools over their shoulders. Older boys balancing baskets of clay and reeds. Everyone moving quietly toward the northern fields before sunrise. The boy walked beside his father along the narrow path beside the Nile. The river looked almost black beneath the fading stars. Reeds whispered softly near the shore while insects hummed low over the water. For a little while, before daylight fully arrived, the world felt calm and still. These moments belonged to workers in the ancient world. The short peaceful space before heat and labor claimed the day. The father finally spoke. He explained that one irrigation channel had begun collapsing near a bend in the fields after recent water flow weakened the walls. If the damage spread, valuable planting land could flood unevenly later in the season. The boy listened carefully. Water management shaped Egyptian life completely. The Nile gave life generously, but only if people controlled and guided its waters properly through canals, channels, and barriers built by many hands over generations. Children learned this early because survival depended upon it. As they approached the fields, dawn slowly touched the eastern horizon. Gray light spread across the land. Then pale gold. Palm trees emerged from darkness one by one. The river reflected faint strips of color beneath the growing sky. Workers gathered near the damaged channel already. Some stood knee-deep in mud examining weak sections of the wall while others unloaded baskets filled with clay and reeds nearby. The smell of wet soil rose heavily into the cool morning air. Birds drifted low across the fields searching for insects among the damp earth. The boy stepped carefully into the mud beside the older workers. Cold water pressed around his ankles while soft clay shifted beneath his feet. The repair work began slowly. Men reinforced broken sections with reeds while others packed wet clay tightly against the weakened walls. Children carried smaller baskets of mud back and forth along the channel edges. The labor demanded patience. A poorly repaired wall could fail again quickly once water pressure returned. The father showed the boy how to press reeds diagonally into the clay for strength before smoothing fresh mud over the surface. The boy copied the movements carefully. Hands learning through repetition again. The sun rose higher little by little. Golden morning light spread across the fields while the cool air slowly disappeared beneath growing warmth. Workers removed outer linen coverings and wiped sweat from their necks. The smell of wet earth mixed with human sweat beneath the brightening sky. Nearby, another laborer worked beside his two sons. One boy looked perhaps 12. The younger no older than 7. Both carried small baskets carefully toward the repair site while their father guided them quietly. The older child worked steadily now with confidence shaped by years of helping. The younger still stumbled sometimes through the mud. Yet even he had already begun learning. This was how preparation unfolded. Not suddenly, but little by little through daily participation in ordinary work. The morning passed in slow rhythm. Carry mud. Pack reeds. Smooth clay. Again and again. Children learned endurance through repetition more than instruction. The body slowly adapted to labor because labor happened constantly. By mid-morning, the sun had become fierce again. Heat settled heavily across the open fields while insects drifted above standing water near the channels. Sweat darkened clothing and mud dried against workers' legs beneath the bright Egyptian sky. The father finally called for a short rest. Workers gathered beneath narrow strips of shade near the edge of the fields while sharing bread, onions, and water from clay jars. The boy sat heavily beside his father. His arms and shoulders already ached. Nearby, several younger children had fallen nearly asleep while eating, exhausted by the morning labor and growing heat. An older worker chuckled softly while watching them. He said children always slept deeply during irrigation season. The others smiled faintly. The boy drank cool water slowly while staring across the fields. Farmers moved in distant rows bending low over dark fertile soil. Oxen pulled wooden plows through damp earth while birds circled overhead beneath the glaring sun. Everything around him seemed connected somehow. The river. The fields. The channels. The workers. The children carrying mud through the heat. Life along the Nile depended upon endless cooperation between land, water, labor, and memory passed carefully through generations. The father spoke quietly beside him. When he himself was young, he had once worked an entire flood season beside his own father repairing damaged channels farther south. He remembered carrying clay until his arms shook from exhaustion each night. The boy listened closely. Ancient adults often described childhood through labor memories because labor shaped so much of growing up. Not because life lacked beauty or tenderness, but because work stood at the center of survival itself. A warm wind moved across the fields carrying the smell of wet soil and reeds. The workers slowly stood again. Rest had ended. The day's labor continued beneath the endless Egyptian sun. And among the adults moving back toward the irrigation walls, children followed too, stepping carefully through the mud while learning, day after day, how to carry the ancient burdens waiting beside the Nile. The heat deepened steadily across the fields as the day moved toward noon. Sunlight poured over the irrigation channels until the wet mud along their edges glowed pale brown beneath the sky. The coolness of morning had vanished completely now. Warm wind drifted slowly through the reeds, carrying the smell of damp earth, river water, and tired bodies working beneath the sun. The boy pressed another bundle of reeds into the soft wall of the channel while older workers packed clay around it carefully. Mud coated his hands up to the wrists. His legs felt heavy from hours standing in shallow water and uneven soil. Still, the work continued at its slow, patient pace. Nearby, an elderly farmer crouched beside a damaged section explaining quietly to two younger boys how water pressure slowly weakened outer walls if the clay dried too quickly beneath strong heat. The children listened closely. Practical knowledge mattered deeply in ancient life because mistakes carried real consequences. A poorly built wall could destroy crops. A damaged storage jar could waste grain. A neglected fishing net could leave families hungry. Children learned responsibility through understanding cause and effect very early. The father moved farther down the channel helping another group reinforce a collapsing edge near deeper water. Sweat darkened the linen across his back while mud clung heavily to his legs. The boy watched him for a moment. Adults often appeared endlessly strong to children at first. But slowly, as childhood faded, young people began noticing exhaustion more clearly. The careful movements after injury. The soreness hidden behind silence. The tired eyes at the end of long days. Ancient children saw adulthood not as freedom from labor, but as deeper entrance into it. A nearby boy accidentally slipped while carrying a basket of wet clay, spilling much of it into the shallow water beside the wall. For a brief moment he froze in embarrassment. But the older workers simply helped him gather the clay again without anger. Everyone made mistakes in exhausting conditions. The heat affected concentration. Bodies grew slower beneath the sun. The boy resumed carrying smaller baskets toward the repair line. Each trip felt slightly harder now. His shoulders burned. His feet ached inside mud-covered sandals. Yet something inside him also felt steadier than before the journey to the market town. He understood more clearly now how all labor connected together. The docks. The fields. The fishing boats. The grain grinding. Everything depended upon countless ordinary tasks completed day after day by ordinary people. Above the fields, birds circled lazily in the growing heat. Farther away near the Nile, fishermen's boats drifted slowly across bright water while rows of palms stood motionless beneath the heavy sky. The ancient world often moved slowly not by choice, but because heat demanded slowness. Workers conserved energy carefully. Movements became deliberate. Voices softened. Even conversations unfolded more quietly beneath the afternoon sun. By midday, the workers paused again. This time they rested beneath a rough shelter built from reeds and wooden poles near the edge of the fields. The shade felt thin but welcome. The boy sat heavily against a basket while drinking water slowly from a clay cup. Nearby, several laborers removed sandals to cool swollen feet against damp earth. One older man stretched aching knees with a soft groan before closing his eyes briefly. Children rested close beside adults, sharing the same exhaustion. A small boy no older than 6 had fallen asleep immediately beside his father, curled against a bundle of reeds while flies drifted lazily through the warm shade around him. The father brushed insects away gently without waking the child. The scene felt deeply ordinary. Ancient families often lived and worked so closely together that care blended naturally into labor itself. The workers ate quietly. Bread, onions, a little dried fish. Simple food carried into the fields each morning. The father handed the boy an extra piece of bread after noticing how quickly he finished his portion. No words were needed. The gesture itself carried affection. Outside the shade shelter, the fields shimmered beneath the heat. In the distance, women moved slowly along narrow paths carrying water jars toward other work crews. Their figures blurred slightly in the bright sunlight rising from the earth. The boy watched them quietly while chewing. Everywhere he looked, people worked. Not frantically. Not dramatically. Simply steadily. Ancient life depended upon constancy more than speed. The father spoke softly after a while. Soon, once the repairs finished, planting would begin again in several northern fields. More workers would arrive from neighboring villages to help prepare the soil properly before the next season deepened. The boy nodded. He already knew planting season meant even longer days. More lifting. More walking beneath the sun. More tired evenings beside the fire. Yet nobody spoke of these things bitterly. The seasons arrived whether people wished them to or not. Life adjusted around them. A faint breeze moved through the shelter at last, cooling the sweat along the boy's face and neck for a few brief moments. Nearby, 2 workers discussed their children quietly. One hoped his eldest son might someday apprentice with a temple scribe in a larger town upriver. The other spoke proudly about his daughter's weaving skills despite her young age. Parents everywhere carried hopes for their children, even inside difficult lives. Not grand ambitions always. Often simply hopes for stability. Enough food. Useful skills. Survival through adulthood. The boy listened carefully while pretending not to. Children often learned much simply by remaining silent near adult conversations. Eventually the rest ended. Workers stood slowly again, joints stiff from sitting too long after heavy labor. The boy followed his father back toward the channel walls. The afternoon stretched ahead beneath the blazing Egyptian sky. Work resumed. The mud had grown warmer now beneath bare hands and feet. Clay dried faster under the harsh sunlight, forcing workers to move quickly before sections hardened improperly. The boy carried reeds while older laborers packed clay into place with wooden tools. A rhythm formed once more. Step. Lift. Carry. Press. Smooth. Again and again. Ancient childhood often involved learning rhythms before understanding larger meanings. The body learned patterns first. How to carry weight. How to pace breathing. How to move efficiently beneath heat. These lessons entered muscles long before words fully explained them. Farther down the channel, several younger children collected dropped reeds and broken branches for evening cooking fires later at home. Even small tasks mattered. Nothing useful went wasted easily in ordinary households. The sun slowly began lowering at last. Shadows stretched longer across the fields. The light softened from white into warmer gold. Workers moved with quiet relief knowing the hardest heat would soon fade. The repaired sections of the irrigation wall now looked stronger and smoother beside the flowing water. The father inspected the final stretch carefully while the boy stood nearby watching. At last he nodded with tired satisfaction. The wall would hold for now. Tomorrow there would still be more work somewhere else, of course. There always was. But this task had been completed properly. The workers washed mud from their hands and legs in the channel water before gathering tools for the walk home. The coolness felt wonderful against sore skin. The boy splashed water across his face and closed his eyes briefly. Nearby, laughter rose softly as one younger worker nearly lost his sandal in the muddy current while climbing the bank. Even exhausted people sometimes laughed together at small things. The long road back toward the village glowed softly beneath the evening sun. Workers walked slowly now, conserving what little energy remained after the day's labor. Birds crossed overhead toward the reeds near the Nile. Smoke from evening cooking fires already drifted upward from distant homes. The boy's legs felt weak with tiredness. His shoulders ached deeply. Yet there was also calmness in the familiar rhythm of returning home after work. Beside him, his father walked quietly carrying tools across one shoulder while warm evening wind moved through the palms along the riverbank. Ahead, the village waited beneath the soft golden light. Families preparing meals. Children gathering near doorways. The smell of bread and smoke rising gently into the cooling air. And beyond it all, the Nile continued flowing silently beside the ancient land, carrying generation after generation steadily forward through the endless rhythm of work, rest, childhood, and time. The evening settled softly across the Nile Valley. Warm light faded slowly from the mud brick homes until the village became a quiet collection of shadows beside the river. Cooking fires glowed gently through open doorways. Smoke drifted upward into the darkening sky. Somewhere near the reeds, frogs called softly while insects hummed in the cooling air. The boy sat outside the house beside his father for a little while longer before sleep. Neither spoke very much. After long days of labor, silence often felt comforting. The younger children already slept inside beneath thin blankets, curled close together while the final embers of the fire flickered against the walls. The mother rested nearby after another day of grinding grain, baking bread, carrying water, and tending the endless needs of the household. Across the village, other families settled into sleep as well. Fishermen rested beside folded nets. Farmers stretched aching backs upon woven mats. Mothers soothed tired children beneath the dim glow of oil lamps. The ancient world grew still. Above them, the stars spread endlessly across the Egyptian sky. The father looked toward the Nile where dark water moved quietly through the night, unchanged by the passing years, unchanged by the countless lives lived along its shores. Children had grown beside this river for generations beyond memory. They had carried water, gathered reeds, repaired nets, learned trades, followed parents into fields beneath the morning sun. Step by step, season after season, childhood slowly became preparation for the long work of living. Not because life was cruel alone, but because survival asked every hand to help. And still, inside those difficult lives, tenderness remained. Shared bread beside a fire. A hand steadying a heavy jar. A parent saving the softer piece of food for a child. Quiet stories beside the reeds at dusk. Small moments of care woven gently through ordinary days. The night breeze cooled the earth little by little. Palm leaves whispered softly overhead. Far away, a boat moved somewhere upon the dark Nile, its oars dipping slowly into the water beneath the stars. The boy's eyes grew heavy. Tomorrow would come again with the grinding stone before dawn. The smell of bread. The river mist rising softly into morning light. Another day beside the endless flowing Nile. Beside work. Beside family. Beside the ancient quiet rhythm of life continuing gently forward through time. And as the village drifted fully into sleep, the river kept moving through the darkness, calm and eternal beneath the silent Egyptian sky.